All right, we're just at 2 o'clock. Got everybody kind of joining in, and as you join us, certainly add your name to the chat. Let us know where you're from. Give us a good sense of who's in the room. We're on Zoom, as everyone knows, and we know that many of you have been using Zoom over the past year and a half. So all are familiar with the fact that with this webinar and other webinars we're sure you've attended, that you're on mute, your video is turned off for the duration. We're using the chat button to introduce folks, to introduce yourselves to everyone. And then there is the Q&A button that we will be using throughout the day or the afternoon to ask questions, post your questions there. We've got our technical team gathering those questions up, and we'll be incorporating them into our panel discussion in Q&A after each of the panels. And certainly panelists can start to answer those questions as time allows. And for those questions that we can't get to, we will certainly gather those up and send those to our panelists and post those on our webpage. And I guess with that, let's get this show on the road, and we'll get ourselves started. Let's see, make sure we're moving forward. Well, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Eileen Aldewenda. I'm the Executive Director of the Council for Watershed Health, and it's good to see so many of you joining us today. Welcome to day 3. We've had 2 days prior to this, as many of you know, focusing on wildfire, weather, water, weeds, wildlife. It's our symposium topic, and it's quite fitting with all that is happening today, and where we're looking to spend the day kind of focusing on these topics. 25 years ago, Dorothy Green founded the Council for Watershed Health to advance the health and sustainability of our region's watersheds, rivers, habitats, both in natural areas and in urban neighborhoods. And we do this in a number of key strategies. There are 3. One is science-based research, another is education, and the third is inclusive stakeholder engagement. And it is with this continued mission in mind that we've convened wildfire experts today, including you in our audience for today's symposium. And our goal today is to try and make sure that we're sharing the state of the science, discuss lessons learned, and identify a resilient path forward. So let me move to our agenda, give you a sense of, well, actually, I'm not moving to the agenda. I'm going to kind of do a little recap on where we've been, and then I'm going to pass the agenda on to Steve, our board president, in just a moment. So this is our final day. We've had, as I mentioned, 3 days in the series. If you missed any of the previous symposium sessions, please visit our website, watershedhealth.org, for the session recordings. There's contact information of our presenters and resources, and there's links to past and upcoming wildfire-related events. And some of those you'll hear about today, and we're hoping that your time with us today is kind of a continuing conversation that you'll have with others going forward. Many of our nonprofit organization partners and agency partners are all holding events that are going to help continue all of our knowledge and sharing of information. And that's certainly timely given how unfortunately we are to be experiencing wildfires far and near. The news is, plenty every day. There's news about the fires, including those that are threatening our giant sequoias, and the most recent fire, the Alisal fire nearby in Santa Barbara County. So during this time of year, and all throughout the year, certainly the impacts are notable. And most recently, the wildfire was identified as one of the key climate vulnerability topics of interest and of importance. And I'm going to encourage you to look to the recently published LA County's climate vulnerability assessment report. There's some really good information that complements and reinforces a lot of the information that we'll be covering in today's symposium. So the success of the symposium is because of you. Those of you that have been joining us, certainly our sponsors, which we'll acknowledge in a moment, and our moderators and our panelists. We've averaged about 150 people each day, which is remarkable given how busy everybody is. And we thank you for making time for joining us today. Drew Reedy is our senior manager at the Council for Watershed Health and has been leading the production of the symposium all 3 days. He has been networking with a number of wildfire experts over his career, and reached out to Sabrina Drill with the University of California's Cooperative Extension to discuss this topic with her. She's been a frequent and longtime collaborator with the Council for Watershed Health, and her in-depth experience and understanding of a number of topics, geographic, ecological, social issues related to wildfire, and her network of experts really, the both of them together has helped us convene a number of really important perspectives to keep in mind and the expertise that we're excited to share today. So I know Sabrina is with us, and I'm going to pass it to her to offer her own welcome. Sabrina? I think you might be on mute. Drew, am I missing something with Sabrina?
Give us a sec, Eileen. We're trying to promote her from attendee. I think we're having a technical problem.
Yep.
Eileen, looks like we've lost Sabrina, so we can move on and bring her back when she's back in the room.
Yeah, I think that definitely makes sense. So with everyone's contribution in terms of contributing to the success of the symposium, we do want to pause and thank our symposium sponsors and our symposium partners, which includes LA County Department of Public Works, LA Department of Water and Power, Jacobs, Southern California Edison, the Scott's Miracle Grow Foundation, and again, all of you. We've partnered with a number of these sponsors in the years past, and their support reflects their commitment to improving the health of our watersheds, and we've done this in a number of ways. I also want to give a special thanks to our board, who, in response to recent wildfires, urged us to focus on this topic for the symposium. And with that, I'd like to welcome Steve Arakawa, the Council for Watershed Health's board president. Steve?
Thank you, Eileen. And thanks everybody for joining us today. My name is Steve Arakawa, and I'm president of the board of the Council for Watershed Health. And I've been on the board as part of my efforts with Metropolitan Water District for probably a little more than 15 years. And I'm very proud of the board. I'm very proud of the council and the work that the council and the staff does, along with all of you and all of the roles that you play. So I'm feeling that the symposium that we have today is in all of our collective interests, and I'm hoping that you get a lot of benefit from it. So on behalf of the Council for Watershed Health Board of Directors, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you today to the symposium. And as I mentioned at the last symposium session a couple of weeks ago, there was several months ago, we talked about topics that we would be taking up, and this was one that really resonated with our board. And so here we are today with that. And I think that I think that it's going to really deliver in terms of who we have on the various panels and the moderation. So I'm looking forward to that. We're looking forward to learning more about how we respond to these events, how we can all work closer together in our responses to fires. And we're looking forward to learning from our speakers and gathering information that we as an organization can integrate into our efforts to ensure the health and resiliency of our watersheds and the communities in which we work. So this is the program today. It's going to focus on fire preparedness and the many efforts being undertaken in our wildland urban interface to work together with property owners to ensure we can respond together to wildfires in the future. Panel 1 experts will share regional approaches to wildfire planning and preparedness and responses from agency perspectives. Panel 2 will focus on community engagement efforts and the importance of interagency collaborations. We've added a presenter to each panel and we've got a full program. We don't have poster presenters today, but we encourage you to stay for the whole program. We think it's real worthwhile. Before we launch into the program that we have, I do want to provide a land acknowledgement. The Council for Watershed Health acknowledges that the land in our watersheds are unceded ancestral homelands of the Gabrielino, Fernandino, Barbareño, and Ventureño. We gratefully acknowledge the native peoples on whose homelands we live and who are the ancestral caretakers of the land, the water, and the life of our watersheds. We recognize that they are still present and we honor their elders, both past and present, and the descendants. The Council for Watershed Health is undertaking several initiatives to listen, understand, and support the native peoples of our region, and we look forward to continuing this work in the months and years ahead. We'd also like to highlight a special event put on by the Burbank Library in cooperation with the Autry Museum and KCET happening tonight. And that's tonight from 7 to 8:30 p.m. entitled Seeing Through the Trees, California Wildfires, a Native American Perspective. And our staff will be putting a link to this event in the chat. So I hope you enjoy that if you are able to tune in. The next thing I'd like to do is Supervisor Hilda Solis wasn't able to be with us today, but she was gracious enough to share a video, a recorded welcome. And Supervisor Solis will be also acknowledging the recently announced retirements of 2 of our most active and accomplished fire professionals in our region. So we'd like to listen to that video that Supervisor Solis was so gracious to provide. The sound is not on.
On behalf of the County of Los Angeles, welcome to the 3rd and final day of the Council for Watershed Health Symposium. The County of Los Angeles wants to thank you for engaging in this important series of informational presentations and discussions. You have 2 full panels, each with 6 subject matter experts, and it will be a very full afternoon, so I don't want to take too much of your time here. I do want to take a minute, though, to thank all the presenters and moderators for the time they put into this event. It is only through gatherings like this where the seeds of collaboration and consensus are sown. Thank you to the Council for Watershed Health's Eileen Alduenda, and board member Steve Arakawa, and to UC's ANR's Dr. Sabina Drill. But before I go, I want to share our thanks to 2 people in the webinar right now. I want to personally thank Martha S. Witter, AK Marti, and Jose Jesus Lopez, or as you know him, J. Lopez. As many of you know, after a long and successful career with Los Angeles County Department's Forestry Division, J. Lopez retired earlier this year. Jay dedicated his professional career to the application of forestry and fire management using sound, scientific methods and adaptive management strategies. Through his many years with the county fire, wearing many hats, Jay exemplified leadership and shared an uncommon passion, talent, and skill, achieving a record of excellence in his endeavors. And while Jay has retired, he has shared that he is not done working to make our region a safer place to be. Jay was recently appointed to the California Board of Forestry and Fire Protection by Governor Gavin Newsom. And the county looks forward to working with Jay in this new role. Fire ecologist Marti Witter has also announced her retirement. During her 20 years with the National Park Service and the Resource Conservation District before that, Marti earned the admiration and respect of her colleagues and the fire community for her dedication, collegiality, enthusiasm, professionalism, sense of humor, and hard work. Marti devoted herself to the pursuit of better policies and practices related to fire preparedness and the protection of lives and property, and the conservation and restoration of biodiversity before, during, and after wildfires. We will be sending both Jay and Marti a county certificate that highlights these and many other successes again, and we wish to thank them both for their service, their leadership, and courage. Our region is safer and more resilient as a result of their efforts. Thank you so much.
So we want to thank Supervisor Solis for taking the time to videotape this and allow us to provide, that message to both Jay and Marti. It's very special providing the county recognition to both of them for all of the work that they've been involved in. And also, it's just important to recognize from all of us and from the council in particular, all of the accomplishments and accolades and things along with that certificate. So the council will be following up with a thank you of our own that will include all of that. So with that, I think that we would like to have each of you say a few things, and I'd like to maybe start off with Jay and just congratulate you for all of that service, and I wish you the best, and maybe allow you to say a few things.
Well, thank you. We appreciate, Marti and I are very appreciative of your recognition. It's to the bottom of our hearts to being acknowledged this way. I'll just say for the both of us is thank you for the opportunity to serve our natural and human communities in the state and in the country. And thank you for your trust and willingness to work with us, Marti and I, on many challenges that we have encountered throughout these many years. We know that these challenges are local with worldwide consequences, but also they are worldwide consequences to our local problem. So these challenges represent a lot of the work that we have done working with you every day. But the most importantly is that we deeply appreciate your kind friendship, the valuable time that we share together, and the many adventures that we face every day out there in the field together. So from Marti and I, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts.
Thank you very much, Jay. We appreciate that. And now I'd like to have Marti maybe say a few things.
Sure. Hi, I just wanted to say thank you so much, Supervisor Solis, and certainly the Council for Watershed Health. And I'm so glad to see Jay recognized. It's so wonderful. He's done so much for so many years. And I'm glad to see that the work continues with this kind of a conference, bringing everybody together. So I hope the work continues on into the future, as it looks like it's going to. Thank you.
Thanks, Marti. Appreciate it. So yeah, retiring from public service. Public service is so special, and I really want to express my deep appreciation and the council's. Retiring from public service, particularly during COVID, sometimes it's, well, in this situation, for sure, it feels a bit weird when you're not able to be around the people that you've worked with in person. But please know how much we appreciate everything. Everyone here wanted to be sure we use this opportunity to thank you both. And, when we see you all in the future, we will do the same. We know you both, neither of you seek the spotlight. And while we hope you enjoy your well-earned retirement, we know we will see you again. Thank you so much for all you've done for our region and for our watersheds. And with that, we'd like to invite Senator Henry Stern to join us for a few words. We're fortunate to have Senator Henry Stern here today. So thank you, Senator Stern, for making the time. Senator Stern is a 6th-generation Californian, a native of the greater Los Angeles area who has represented nearly 1 million residents of the 27th Senate District since being elected to serve the 27th Senate District in November of 2016. Senator Stern has chaired the Senate Natural Resources and Water Committee since 2018, where he has worked tirelessly to bolster the state's wildfire preparedness, push to have the state address the climate change emergency, improve our democracy, and fight to help some of California's most vulnerable members. Senator Stern sits on the Senate's Budget, Environmental Quality, Judiciary, and Energy, Utilities, and Communication Committees, as well as the Budget Subcommittee on Resources, Environmental Protection, and Energy, and also recently appointed as chair of the Joint Legislative Committee on Emergency Management. So those are really, really key areas that we all count on you for, Senator Stern. And I'd like to just welcome you to make some remarks today, and thank you for being here.
Appreciate it, Steve. Am I coming through okay?
Yes, you are.
Great. Yeah, no, I was looking through the list of your attendees and the folks that the council was able to bring together, all in honor of Jay and Marti here, and you've summoned quite an arsenal of know-how and leadership at all levels. I think it's really a testament to the council and sort of the model of focusing on this watershed health, this ecology is sort of the basis for defining fire science and strategy here that is evident in the fact that you've got CAL FIRE involved and UCANR and USGS is here. And I just appreciate, I think US Forest Service, such an integrated group, in addition to all our local government leaders like Supervisor Solis and the rest of the county and a lot of our municipal leadership and the RCDs. I mean, it's quite a showing. So Jay and Marti, you've done pretty incredible work. And I don't think, after hearing all this, I don't think we're going to allow you to retire. So I think I don't know what kind of authority I have within the resources committee, but we'll look into that, because it sounds like we can't quite afford to leave your knowledge on the sidelines, Jay or Marti. So at the resources committee, we have jurisdiction over issues like forest health, which ends up becoming a wildfire issue. And then I also, in chairing joint emergency management, sort of look at overall response capabilities, both at OES and at CAL FIRE and our local agencies. And, I've been through, I think, 18 major fires since coming into office, and about 40 regular here and gone fires. We were doing the math earlier this week, and living through that, even as a young person in the Santa Monica Mountains, I know it well. But now in this roost as an environmental attorney and as chair of this committee, and trying to craft legislation and reinvent and reinvigorate the state's approach to wildfire prevention, it's a unique spot to be in, and we need you. I would say that's my main message: is we're going to need this kind of integrated planning to get through these issues. When you're looking at an issue like fire prevention or forest health, but you're not thinking about ecological restoration at the same time, it's an incomplete process. When you're looking at a wildfire protection plan and you're only thinking about ecology and you're not thinking about social vulnerability risk, it's an incomplete process. So integration is really what's going to make this work. And I'm more and more passionate also about that integration at the governance level too, where state and local government start to work more closely together, and we don't see each other as separate entities. And I think this last budget showed it, that, the public doesn't care who's responding, right? If it's their county fire, but there's a mitigation grant that already made that property more fire resilient months prior because of a defensible space inspection occurred from, local fire department or conservation corps, or someone from the MRCA, or someone with California Climate Corps, right? Like, how to integrate work on a different time frame, I think, than just disaster to disaster. We can't afford that. We know that, and that'll bankrupt us as a community and as a state, as we're learning all too well. So we passed SB 63 and a couple other wildfire reform measures this year that will hopefully reorient and re-empower councils like this to bring your fire science and knowledge to bear, and folks like Jay and Marty's knowledge to bear. And also in the budget, we're looking at regions like Los Angeles and places that haven't fared as well, say, in finding their footing in fire prevention funding. We as a region haven't sort of found a way to cobble this unwieldy beast that's like this wet wildlife, wildfire, and then right into urban interface that has a whole suburban end between a place like Chatsworth or Porter Ranch or deep in San Gabriel Valley. We know so many of these communities. Santa Clarita, it's not just your Malibus, you know, it's middle-class families in LA, and they're all over the place in California. And so I tend to be partial to people, and I think that should really drive our whole strategy. And so I would leave that with you, that let's keep letting people drive this process and stay very human and very vigilant. And you guys are tip of the spear now. So we got a big year ahead of us. Budget's going to be a big deal, more policy to come, and hopefully just good hard work on the ground. So God bless y'all for the sacred work you do. And thanks for having me.
Well, thank you, Senator Stern. We really appreciate it. And we really appreciate all the hard work that you do, both for our area and for the state. It's really critical. And I think that your remarks really help motivate all of us. And so we appreciate that. The council speaks for everyone here when we offer our thanks for joining us today. We know that you're busy, and some of our staff follows you on Twitter, and we want to congratulate you regarding the birth of your daughter. We're very happy for you, and we wish you the best. It's just a great time, and it'll continue to be a great time. So anyway, thanks very much for being here.
Thank you for the shout out. And yeah, it's all for Ava. Everything's for Ava now. Thank you, Steve.
Very good. Thanks, Senator Stern. Okay, well, so let's get started now with our first panel. And I'd like to introduce our first moderator, Clark Stevens. And Clark Stevens is the Executive Officer of the Resource Conservation District of the Santa Monica Mountains. Clark is a teacher, a conservationist, and architect, specializing in design for culturally and ecologically critical places. Ecological restoration to create recreational, educational, economic, and spiritual value is at the core of his planning and design work. Currently, much of the time at the RCD is spent on research, design, and planning strategies in response to wildfire and in support of resilient communities and ecosystems. Since 2019, Clark has served on the advisory board of the California Fire Science Consortium, bringing expertise on home hardening and defensible space at the wildland-urban interface. We're very fortunate to have Clark here today to moderate our first panel of the day, and we welcome you, Clark. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Steve. I really appreciate the opportunity to be in conversation and to listen to the great collection of panelists we have on integrated fire management. We're going to cover a lot of bases today, and you know, it's a little bit like drinking from a fire hose here on day 3. Day 1 and 2 we're so full, but you know, if we're going to talk integration, that's necessary, right? I think that the conference has done a very good job of letting us all know the level of complexity we face. But before we start with and introduce the panelists, I just wanted to, while we're on acknowledgements, it's interesting, Dorothy Green, as a founder of what became the Center for Watershed Health, is another one of our ancestors that we ought to acknowledge. I'm not going to put Jay and Marty in the ancestor category yet, but I refer to them as Professor Jay and Professor Marty because as the executive officer of the Resource Conservation District, I've learned so much over the years through an integrated interagency collaborative effort that is the Santa Monica Mountains Fire Safe Alliance. And we've all learned together, but I think in particular, I feel like as a moderator here, I'm just at the point where I can sit in the same group with everyone. And that group today will include, in the first batch of folks, we'll have David Haas starting us off. David's a forester with the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. Then we'll hear from Rorie Skei, Chief Deputy Director with the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy and the Mountains Conservation Recreation. Actually, it's the Mountains Recreation and Conservation Authority, MRCA. And then we'll move on to LA County Fire Forestry Division Chief Ron Durbin, and then Dania Gutierrez of the National Forest Service will join us, and followed by Angeles National Forest Supervisor Jerry Perez for the National Forest perspective. And then we'll wrap up with yet another great representative from UC Cooperative Extension, Specialist Van Butsic, who will give us some big picture land use trends and recommendations for new development. So with that, I think we'll move right on and introduce you to David Haas.
Good afternoon, everyone. David Haas, CAL FIRE San Bernardino Unit Forester, registered professional forester, licensed pest control advisor, and qualified applicator. So next slide. So today I'll just briefly be going over who we are as a department, where we work, and what we do. Obviously everybody knows us as the state's fire department. We have our incident management teams. We respond to fires throughout the state, but we are a lot more than that. Our full name is the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. I jokingly say when you get a firefighter in charge, you lose that forestry part. We used to be CDF, now we're CAL FIRE, but regardless of all that, our mission has not changed. We serve and safeguard the people and protect the property and resources of California. In addition to the fire suppression component of the department, we're the state's regulatory agency for forestry. We handle many other tasks regarding resource management. Then also the Office of the State Fire Marshal falls within the scope of CAL FIRE. One thing I forgot to include in this slide is, I'd say, a partner, not necessarily part of the department, but is the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection, of which Chief Lopez is now a member. Congratulations, that's no simple task, but the Board of Forestry develops the policy and regulations that the Department of Forestry then enforces. So again, not part of the department, but definitely work together. Next slide. So CAL FIRE has the state broken down into 21 units, generally aligned with county boundaries. The San Bernardino unit includes San Bernardino, Inyo, and Mono counties. Then we have 6 contract counties as well. In the contract counties, we essentially provide funding for basic fire suppression and pre-fire services within the state responsibility area portions of those counties. And you ask, what is state responsibility area? Next slide, please. So the state is broken down into 3 types of jurisdiction. And when it comes to fire suppression responsibilities, and it's called responsibility areas. I know there's a lot of text on that slide, but I like to put it simply for folks in that if you are on national forest, BLM lands, national parks, Department of Defense, that's all federal responsibility area. And the federal government is responsible for fire suppression and management of those lands. If you're within an annexed city, you're in local responsibility area, and your local fire department is responsible for fire suppression responsibilities in those areas. Pretty much everywhere else is the jurisdiction of CAL FIRE. And those bullets are the definitions that allow us to categorize land as SRA or not. But that is where we live and work as a department. For the most part, there are a handful of exceptions. So next slide. So within that state responsibility area, what do? We do defensible space inspections on a unit by unit basis. And Public Resource Code 4291 provides us the authority to do the defensible space inspections, but the actual language that we enforce is found in the California Code of Regulations, section 1299. And then also I referenced two other pieces of legislation there. AB 3038, you all may be familiar with at this point, required that any property sold within state responsibility area or very high fire hazard severity zones and local responsibility areas have defensible space inspections done prior to sale of the property. And the other piece of legislation there, AB 3074, creates a 0 to 5 foot no ember zone as part of the defensible space standards. I'm sorry, ember resistant zone. And within that zone, you're not allowed to have any flammable material. That regulation doesn't take effect until 2023 though. So even within the state responsibility area, you could in theory have multiple people conducting defensible space inspections on your property. At least in San Bernardino County, the county fire department is responsible for protection of structures in terms of fire protection. CAL FIRE is responsible for protection of wildland. So within SRA, you could have a defensible space inspection done by CAL FIRE, and then the county could have codes above and beyond the minimum standards required by the state. And so they could go in and do additional inspections. And those defensible space standards protect your home from wildland fires, but they also protect our wildland from home fires. So the defensible space really serves a dual purpose. In addition to the defensible space inspections, we have internally funded fuel reduction projects. Some of you may see some of them going into effect in your communities: fuel breaks, fuel reduction projects, a wide variety of different projects to help reduce fuels and reduce fire risk. And then ancillary to that is our prescribed burning. It's also, considered fuel reduction, but it's conducted under slightly different CEQA documents. So we have our vegetation management program, which is based off programmatic environmental impact report from the 1980s. And that's really focused on prescribed fire in chaparral. Some of you may also be aware of CalVTP, our vegetation treatment program, which was passed in the past year or two. And so that's similar to our VMP program. Other than that, it's a programmatic environmental document designed to allow for all types of vegetation treatment across all vegetation types. So a very useful tool for all state agencies. Next slide. What else do we do? Grants are pretty well known for these at this point in time. Since 2014, 2015, we've been funding fire prevention. Well, the vast majority of these grant programs through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Fire prevention, you may be familiar with. Those are, varying scale fuel reduction projects that can be fuel reduction, wildfire analysis and planning, or outreach and education. Forest health are larger scale landscape level grants designed really for multi-jurisdiction, large forest treatment projects. And then we have our urban and community forestry program. That's where you may see some of our presence outside of the state responsibility area. We work primarily in, annexed cities and counties in that program. Our California Forest Improvement Program is a cost share program designed to help provide financial assistance to smaller forest landowners so they can complete forest management projects on their properties. And I'm not too familiar with the volunteer fire assistance program, so I won't go into that too much detail. Yeah, so lastly, the Office of the State Fire Marshal. They do a lot, and some of the legislation that's been passed, quite a bit of legislation that's been passed in the past 2 years, applies a lot to the Office of the State Fire Marshal. Our land use planning program works with cities and counties when they're updating their general plan to make sure their safety element complies with all applicable rules and regulations. They also are the coordinator for the NFPA Firewise Community Program, which is an excellent opportunity for communities to meet some basic standards and get some recognition for the work they're doing. And they The land use planning program and the state fire marshal could be a whole presentation in itself. So again, won't go into too much detail. And one of their other responsibilities is development of the fire hazard zone severity maps. If you go to the next slide, please. I know there's a little bit of jargon on there, but by public resource code and government code, CAL FIRE is required to identify fire hazard severity zones throughout the state of California in the SRA. So that's a moderate, high, and very high. And then in local responsibility areas, we're also responsible for identifying very high fire hazard severity zones. And the fire hazard severity zones can be a pretty impacting factor in terms of what standards you have to comply with when building a new home in regards to the California Building Code, Chapter 7A, and the fire safe building standards, and then also the defensible space standards and so on. So definitely worth taking a look at. There are several online viewers where you can identify your home's fire hazard severity zone. Next slide. And then we also do public outreach and education like this, and similar programs to a lot of other fire departments do. We have our new mascot, no longer Smokey Bear. We now have Captain Cal, who you see there. So be on the lookout at your local public event for Captain Cal. And that's all I've got. I didn't provide my contact information, I realize, but if you ever have any questions, comments, concerns, you can use your preferred web browser and search David Haas CAL FIRE, and you'll find me very easily. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you, David. I know that the contact information is going to be in, there's a great resource page, many pages of resources that you're going to be able to see both during and after the conference. So David, everyone will be able to follow up. So thank you. Our next panelist is Rorie Skei, again, Chief Deputy Director of what we call the Conservancy and the Mountains Recreation and Conservation Authority, MRCA. And Rorie, look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Clark. And I really appreciate being here today. Thank you to Sabrina Drell for inviting me. For decades now, fire planning, fire prevention, firefighting, and post-fire recovery in our parklands have been priorities for the Conservancy and the MRCA in conjunction with our other partners, LA County Fire, Ventura County Fire, National Park Service, and California State Parks. Next, please. So this slide shows our legislatively established zone, which stretches eastward to Sierra Madre, west to Calleguas Creek, north to the Santa Clara River in several locations, and includes a big chunk of Angeles National Forest. The MRCA manages its own land and Conservancy parkland in this region, and those are the green spots you see within the greater area. Next slide. The Conservancy is one of several recipients throughout the state of a regional forest and fire capacity program grant. And we've been working collaboratively with MRCA and a consultant and our other land management partners to develop the regional priority plan, which we hope will promote restorative wildland management practices, building on previous and concurrent efforts to update risk mapping and notably to identify potential projects that can mitigate fire starts and spread and assist in making our area more fire resilient. Clearly, wind events are the worst problem we all face, as we know. Santa Ana winds, Sundowner winds, Diablo winds make everything worse. The Conservancy also received this year $12 million in state funding. Thank you very much, Senator Stern, Assemblymember Bloom, Senator Anthony Portantino and the Southern California delegation. That money was geared to provide early action fire resiliency grants, and building on our preliminary findings from the RFFC project, we granted it all out to local governments, tribes, the MRCA, and nonprofits in order to advance categories, particularly for habitat restoration, ignition prevention, workforce development, structure hardening, technologies and equipment, and public education. Next. So this slide, and you may have seen this, Sarah Kevorkian of MRCA presented a poster project at the last symposium on September 30th. But this is a first phase of a 3-year program on our agency parkland along 4 miles of the 101 freeway in a well-known wind-driven fire corridor. The goal here is to begin to convert flashy fuel weed growth to more fire-resistant and potentially ember-screening native vegetation. Planting native oaks and potentially other resistant species like toyon is planned for later this fall in some selected areas. The project is labor intensive, there's no doubt about that, and it will require annual follow-up work. It incorporates workforce development with the California Conservation Corps, LA Conservation Corps, who are also grantees, and they are co-benefits along with habitat restoration. So we plan for deep watering and mulching techniques to help assist survival of the trees, and obviously with the workforce doing that. We're stressing mechanical weed removal with personnel trained to avoid desirable species like native bunch grasses and low-growing forbs. We're not proponents of prescription burning in our chaparral or coastal sage scrub ecosystems. They do not seem to be efficacious and are already too frequently burned shrublands. We want to avoid further type conversion to weedy growth. And I think some of those points were brought up in the last symposium. Other grantees for vegetation management and habitat projects are listed on the slide, such as the Conejo Open Space Conservation Agency, Rancho Simi Rec and Park District, and the Cree People Land Trust. And of course, fuel reduction projects should advance biodiversity along with climate resiliency. That's the overarching goal, in addition to keeping fires from spreading. Next slide. Investments for ignition and spread prevention are essential. We funded increased eyes and ears patrol of susceptible roadways and parks, especially during red flag days, including extra ranger and fire division staffing, and with help from Topanga Arson Watch and California Emergency Mobile Patrol. For example, the slide at the top, you may have seen this in Jessica Morse's opening presentation, but we provided that. This is one of our MRCA rangers who made a bust of a truckload of illegal fireworks on 4th of July on Mulholland Drive, and he almost certainly averted a fire start. Grants were also made for upgrading or augmenting local cities' emergency communication equipment and their emergency operation centers. Also structure hardening, hazard tree removal in one municipality, community chipper days, new water storage tanks, and power pole undergrounding are all granted funds. The nonprofit Community Nature Connection provides community information programs and workforce development as well. They've done a number of programs that are up on the top. Next slide. Equipment investments for mitigating ignition and spread are essential. You can see here a typical type 3 4-wheel drive brush engine that gets deployed throughout our region by our own MRCA crews, and they're often called out on OES fires. I think that we've sent a resource up to the Alisol fire. They have been a water tender. Also, a green climber. It's basically a remote controlled mower, kind of a Roomba for weed abatement. And it does require a trained operator, as even with weed whips, we want to make sure that the machinery and the weedy fuel removal does not also take out desirable vegetation. But this mower has actually proved pretty efficient, and it can navigate some pretty steep slopes. So it's a great force multiplier as far as getting projects done quickly. Also being implemented, and I think it has great promise, are fire detection cameras at strategic locations in parks trail cams, and FLIR, or forward-looking infrared devices, and drones, which can pinpoint light and heat sources in open space parklands and help us identify illegal campfires, illegal encampments. And that's sort of an ongoing project for the MRCA staff at this point. Next. Next slide, please. There we go. So our expectation is that state fire resiliency funding will continue. It does seem to be a good trend, and our legislators and our Natural Resources Agency and governor have been very invested in helping throughout the whole state make these things happen. We do hope to assist projects through the resiliency grants that we are able to make, and those identified through the Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Project, because investing in more resilient wildlands is indeed key to our communities and our climate. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Rorie. I definitely want to return in the discussion to that perhaps counterintuitive idea and big project that you have going on that links habitat restoration with ignition prevention. That's not necessarily a combination I think many people would understand initially, that you could have both. So we'll return to that. Next up is Ron Durbin. Ron is yet another longtime collaborator in the Mountains in the Fire Safe Alliance, the Santa Monica Mountains Fire Safe Alliance. And he's going to talk about such collaborations and how we can work together to improve community defensible space. So thanks, Ron, for being here.
Morning, everyone. Afternoon, actually, now. So first, I just want to congratulate Jay and Marty for their retirements, but not so much, right? And of course, to Jay's appointment to the Board of Forestry. So he's a great resource for all of us to draw on. So thank you, Jay, for all the work that you've done for us and in the future. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about how we work through the community and build defensible space. So again, I'm Ron Durbin. I'm the Chief of Forestry for LA County Fire Department. I've been working here now for nearly 24 years. Just like Clark said, we have a lot of collaboration that we do on a regular basis. So one of the keys, though, is that the fire department's mission is to protect life, property, and the environment. We have multiple wildfire vulnerabilities across the region, including the Angeles National Forest, all those foothill communities, Santa Clarita, Whittier. But one of probably the crown jewel for LA County in terms of biodiversity that also has this overlapping wildfire threat is the Santa Monica Mountains, and that's where I'm going to focus today. Next slide. So we've been building a collaboration over a long period of time. The Santa Monica Mountains, they really have a well-informed and environmentally savvy constituency. There's numerous environmental regulations and a need to balance wildfire risk. So back in 2008, Supervisor Yaroslavsky and the fire department created the Santa Monica Mountains Fire Safe Alliance. And so this is a group of at least 20 agencies, public, private, that have come together to find solutions and then resources to solve our fire risk problems. Next slide. So one of the early projects was developing and publishing this roadmap to fire safety, right? How to create defensible space in the Santa Monica Mountains. It was intended for homeowners to have a guide on what they need to build defensible space specifically for their own homes. So next slide. So our mission with the Fire Safe Alliance is land stewardship and creating defensible space. And what we try to do and have done over the years is consistently learn and then implement these best management practices and become more knowledgeable and skilled with this new information and bring it to the homeowners that we serve. Next slide. So there's various issues that come on a regular basis to the Fire Safe Alliance. Typically, they go through the supervisor's office first because they're the ones that tend to hear about concerns. Defensible space on public land has always been a primary issue. MRCA, of course, just like Rorie spoke about, they're one of our key partners in helping us build defensible space. We work with them on a regular basis to do clearance, defensible space work, and particularly adjacent to structures. So we're working on public land to serve that private interest that's within 200 feet of those structures. So some of the work that's come out of this has been the Santa Monica Mountains CWPP, Chief Lopez, Jay Lopez worked on that with Marti Witter and the National Park Service. Fire Safe Councils have been further developments that have come out of it. And we've got further development with and a lot of interest through the North Topanga Fire Safe Council, Horizon Hills, Malibu Lakes. So all of those partners are what we do in the Fire Safe Alliance. And typically what happens is the issue will come to the Alliance. We'll notify anybody that's affected or impacted by whatever that issue might be, coordinate together, and then come up with solutions, and then finally implementation for the homeowners. Next slide. So the key for all of what we do is community vegetation management. And it's key that all of the homeowners, and just like David Haas said, each one is responsible for their own part, but they play a role in protecting wildlands as well. So some of the keys in this, and you'll see in the following slides, we wanted to help the homeowner identify their location on the land, looking at topography and environmental conditions. And all of this is built inside the roadmap document. So next slide. All right, so one of the key conditions where we have structures at top of slope, the setbacks are really important. So particularly for new development, I think the homeowners that come in and they buy a home and they've already got it existing, then those folks need to focus on hardening the structure and then looking at their defensible space, in particular with slope alignment, prevailing winds, habitat sensitive species, riparian zones that's shown in this, and what they need to do. So in particular, this one, shaded fuel breaks are always a good tool where we get to keep habitat in place, take care of the fine fuels, remove any dead material. And then of course, for every homeowner, road access is really important as well. So next slide. So some of our fuels in the Santa Monicas, we saw this in the Woolsey fire in 2018. Some of those fuels, wildland areas are over 20, 25 years old. That's where we get our most extreme fire behavior. So, return intervals less than 7, and that's been spoken before. We tend to see more flashier fuels come in. But our particular concern for something like this, where a structure is mid-slope, gradual slopes, they generally may not have to go out to 200 feet, which is the LA County Fire Code. We can require up to 200 feet depending on conditions. So we want to be concerned about these older fuels, and this is what was previously spoken about with the Alisal fire right now. They've got live fuel moisture conditions that are 60% approximately or lower. And that's coupled with Santa Ana wind event, and that produces our extreme fire behavior. So these are the concerns that we all have. And so again, the primary focus is the structure first, that first 5 feet that's identified in AB 3074 that David Haas just spoke of. And then working our way out from the structure, making sure we have shaded fuels. And then the farther away we get from the structure, then we can have more fuels and more trees and closer together. And as soon as we get out for LA County outside of 200 feet, then you would get a native fuel bed or vegetation and habitat that we want to preserve and protect. Next slide. So one of our greatest concerns in the Santa Monica Mountains is we have a lot of structures that are mid-slope. They're right at the center of the slope. They have fuels above, they have fuels below. So the greatest thing that has to happen here is the structure has to be hardened. So there's lots of different ways to do that. And I'll talk about that in a second. And then of course you want to deal with your defensible space, particularly downslope, and then the fire access roads. And all of those things together are keys to the firefighter safety and structure survival. So next slide. So first, the collaborative effort that the Fire Safe Alliance does, We work with fire safe councils. We work with cities on developing CWPPs, and of course, fire safe councils like the North Topanga has developed their own CWPP, Community Wildfire Protection Plan. And those plans are vehicles for grant funding. So once the risks have been identified, then they can apply for grant funding as a nonprofit. And that would be overseen, in our case, by LA County Fire Department, which reports to CAL FIRE. So MRCA is also a key component of our collaboration in the Fire Safe Alliance. Rorie just mentioned the oak tree planting and in strategic areas, and looking at ember cast and the way embers flow over the landscape, and how we can use habitat restoration and oak trees towards potentially catching embers and depositing embers where we'd like them to go, not where they want to go on their own. So that's kind of a study that we're working on now. We currently are working with regional planning on a county land management plan and an integrated wildfire safety plan. And we have all of the data, but we're developing now wildfire risk analysis, looking at strategic advantage and where specific projects need to be. And then over time, we're going to develop this county land management plan with the integrated wildfire safety plan, so that we have a watershed type of plan that looks at overall everything from habitat to wildfire safety. Next slide. So getting to specific, which was related to the roadmap. Here's a project out in Corral Canyon. Some of you may be familiar with it. It looks like it's got defensible space, but it's backwards, right? It's that donut shape where it's cleared farther away, and then closer to the structure, there's far more fuel. And of course you have decks, and you have to ask yourself, does this really work? So next slide. So it doesn't, right? We know that right next to the structure, that's where our greatest vulnerabilities are. And so the defensible space, when you reflect on that last slide, need to be switched so that we have more defensible space next to the structure. And then the farther away, that's where you have more and more native fuels. So again, in LA County, our fire code is up to 200 feet. And so our goal is to reduce that ember cast, reduce heat, and allow a place for firefighters to get in there and defend the structures safely. Next slide. So here's a different example. This is in the national park area. We have a Native American Indian Culture Center. It's got a Chumash demonstration village next to it. If you look kind of right in the center of the slide, you can see some hard lines. That's where the structure is. So next slide. So this is a much better example of the type of defensible space we're looking for. You can see that there would be additional fuel behind and in the foreground, if you're familiar with the site. So right around the structure, they've done a really great job with that first 5 feet. The structure itself doesn't have as many areas for embers to catch. It's actually looking much nicer now, I believe, since it's probably filled in a little bit. But they've done a really, really good job of separating fuels. The natives aren't completely cleared out. And so all we're trying to do is reduce ember cast and give the firefighters a place to make a stand. And clearly that has happened here. Again, if you've seen this in the past, you'll know that there's been fire scars all around it. And it's done really well through some fire history. Great, next slide. So in the Fire Safe Alliance, this is really our next project, the current project, where we have built a fire-hardened demonstration structure. It was planned in 2010. And like many of you know, these projects can take a really long time to get going. It was funded by the Board of Supervisors. We were working through regional planning, trying to get all the permits. Took a long time to get it done. It was finally constructed in 2019. We have a FEMA landscape grant that was just approved in July of this year. We expect to have it planted and installed through the spring. So we're ready to go in early spring of next year. And it's a house out public education program. So this structure, let's go to the next slide. First, we'll give you an indication of where it is. It's in the Malibu area. It's the Malibu Forestry Unit. It's just north of Piuma and Malibu Canyon Road. Next slide. So it's at the Malibu Forestry Unit. It's right behind the main office. It's got oak woodland. You can see that all around it. It's got chaparral on some of the slopes that are south facing. Used to have a ton of pine trees in there. Back in 2008, with approval from my chief at the time, we took out all of the pine trees and then started planting new oaks. And right through that center of the path, you can see the smaller oaks there. Most of those were 36-inch box oaks that we planted. So next slide. So here it is. Here's the demonstration structure. It was designed by our moderator, architect Clark Stevens. It's got numerous examples of home hardening features, windows, doors, roofing material, connections, so that we have minimal opportunities for ember intrusions. Next slide. Again, it's got heavy timber, venting, concrete masonry units, the block, right? Siding, stucco, all different types of materials that a homeowner can come, get hands-on, touch, feel, see how it works. There's minimal locations for embers to gather and burn with residency time. So, and then finally, moving on, almost done, we're going to have this landscape come in fall of next year. So that's the next piece of this project. So next slide. And all of this, right, it really takes what the focus again of what the Fire Safe Alliance is to have homeowners take individual responsibility for their own area and work through their communities, right? Building that defensible space. And when I talk about brush clearance, that's a term that's in the fire code. When I talk about brush clearance, it's always this balance between defensible space with environmental sensitivity. And that's really we want the message to be, is that we can have both, right? We can have defensible space. We can have habitat that serves the community at the same time, right? And then lastly, next slide, there's two resources, Ready, Set, Go, and the roadmap to defensible space. You can find that in the section that Clark talked about a little bit while ago. Next slide. And that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ron. Appreciate all the information there and really look forward to the continued collaboration out there at the forestry site, and inviting everyone to come visit us when we have that together. I think we need to continue our education and having a hands-on place to go where you can see multiple approaches to defensible space and an appropriately managed landscape ecologically, as well as from a fire resiliency standpoint. It's going to be great to see. Next up, we have Dania Gutierrez, who's going to talk about another kind of partnership, and that's between residents, communities, and the public agencies that manage their common lands. So thank you, Dania, for being here.
Thanks, Clark, and thank you all for the opportunity to speak to you today. So I'm going to be focusing on lands past those private property lines. So we're going to be talking about public lands primarily, and how agency partners can help build capacity and provide more resources to the work that needs to get done. Next slide. So for those of you not familiar with the National Forest Foundation, we are a congressionally chartered nonprofit that works pretty much exclusively with the U.S. Forest Service, where we focus on conservation and recreation improvements across the National Forest System. Next slide. I am the Southern California Program Manager for the National Forest Foundation. So my program focuses on the 4 Southern California National Forests, Los Padres, Angeles, San Bernardino, and the Cleveland National Forest. And our program focuses on what really matters most to folks out here in Southern California. So keeping our forests healthy, keeping them resilient, having a place to recreate, keeping these are the headwaters for a lot of our local water supply, so making sure our watersheds are resilient as well, and doing community and youth engagement across this region around and within our national forests. Next slide. So I wanted to share a little bit about how we work and how this public-private partnership comes into play. So as I mentioned, our priority is increasing capacity and bringing in more resources. And we do that in a couple of different ways. So we will partner directly with a national forest unit. So we'll partner with the Forest Service and serve as project managers for a variety of projects for on-the-ground implementation, whether it's a forest health related project or a recreation improvement project. We also raise and manage funds and kind of pool. What we do a lot of is pooling different kinds of resources from public, federal, state, local grants to private funding. So thinking about corporate partnerships, grants from foundations, or individual donations. We manage grants and contracts. So a lot of the work that we try to do is keeping whoever's out doing the work as local as possible. So we do a lot of our work with conservation corps, and we do our best to hire local contractors. And then the last 2 points I want to touch on is balancing the need between trying to get shovel-ready projects completed. We know that there's a huge need. The state and the U.S. Forest Service have big goals for fuels management and forest health. So how do we make sure that we address the backlog of need, but also how do we help the Forest Service look ahead? So how do we help with environmental compliance and planning? How do we help prioritize areas that are in need of some ecosystem management or wildfire resilience work? So we are here to support the Forest Service in kind of building out those plans and bringing in other stakeholders that can help inform strategy. And then we can get creative. We are a nonprofit, so we can do some things that other public agencies can't. And then we can be nimble and responsive to what existing needs. The example I always like to use is that during the pandemic, we helped support the Forest Service in increasing the number of bathrooms that were maintained so that other recreation areas could stay open during that high demand. So yeah, really like to be nimble and creative with the Forest Service. Next slide. So I'll just touch on a couple of quick projects as examples of what we're currently working on. So we have a few fuels management projects. The one that I really like to talk about is this one on the San Bernardino National Forest, actually. The burn area that you see here on the left is the El Dorado fire. That was the fire that was started by the Gender Reveal Party. If you recall, I'm sure it was pretty massive. There were a lot of evacuations that needed to happen. And the work that we're focusing on is in the community of Angeles Oaks. In the picture on the right, you'll see where the El Dorado fire hit the fuel breaks that the Forest Service had actually been managing. And firefighters out there were able to slow things down and make sure that this community was protected. So that's on the east side. We're working on the fuel breaks on the right, the west side of the community. And we're really excited to be able to be a part of this community resilience project that the Forest Service has been in partnership with Angeles Oaks for years. Next slide. So we also support reforestation projects. So we do want to focus on forest health and post-fire restoration. One of the things that I'm really excited about with reforestation projects is balancing the need of, I'm saying balance a lot, but I think that's really important part to what you're trying to get to with integrated fire management. So balancing the need of where is it necessary to just let nature do its thing and let natural regrowth happen? And when is, at the very, bare minimum, do we need to go in and do active restoration? I think that's something that the Forest Service is currently working on and being, making sure that we're stewarding this land properly. And we're excited to be a part of that conversation. And I'm sure Jerry will touch on how climate change plays a role in all of these decisions that need to get made. basically month to month, because these windows of operation are becoming smaller and smaller and smaller as climate conditions continue to intensify. Next slide. So what's next? Next slide. We're really excited and honored to have to be the recipient of a couple of state grants. So we're trying to step in, as I said, to increase capacity and provide resources where the Forest Service's budget might be a little limited. We're really excited to use these state funds and are really appreciative of the wildfire early action funds that were provided in the budget that Governor Newsom signed earlier this year. So one of those grants is a CAL FIRE Direct Award that we received to conduct fuels reduction primarily on the San Bernardino National Forest. And then we also received a grant from the Rivers and Mountains Conservancy to conduct fuels reduction across the San Gabriel Mountains. One of those, the priority is to focus on areas that have infrastructure or are communities of interest. So for example, we're going to be doing a lot of work along the Big Pines area and near Wrightwood as well. So we're excited to just work in that area, bring in some contractors where there might be some more technical expertise that's needed, but then also really focus on workforce development and getting conservation corps out there to do some good work. Next slide. So with one of the grants that we're also very proud of receiving, we are now looking at what does sub-regional work look like? So how do we connect all of these landscapes and work across multiple jurisdictions to address these regional needs? So we received a CAL FIRE Forest Health Grant and a National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grant to address the gold-spotted oak borer infestation that's currently across most of Southern California forests. And we'll be coordinating with lots of different kinds of partners, the Forest Service, cities, counties, fire safe councils, other nonprofits, also working with conservation corps and working with residents to address the satellite infestations that have now found their way across multiple forests and across private land. And we'll be working on infested tree removal, chemical treatments, and some education with local partners. This grant is just going to be a really good pilot for NFF and for the Forest Service as well. How do we work across these landscapes so that we can address these needs? And I'm just really excited to be a part of this. Next slide. So one last thing I wanted to highlight is our Southern California Forest Fund. So that's another way that we bring in sort of like the private side of things. How do we, we have a lot of funding, but we know that that's not going to be enough. So one of the ways that NFF has been just trying to bring in the public is building marketing campaigns around this crowdsourced fundraising opportunity. And we've been able to tap in small businesses and corporations who are really eager to just give, and we've opened up this opportunity. So I'm excited to have this grow and really build up capacity through, interest from folks, who just want to provide some help. I think my next slide is my last one. Okay, thank you, everybody. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dania. I appreciate us moving to from the Santa Monica Mountains ecosystems out to the national forest areas. I'm all in Los Angeles County. I mean, just the diversity here. And so the need for integration with different partners is really highlighted with your presentation. So next up, we have we've got Jerry Perez with us. And again, continuing on the kind of national forest side of things and moving up yet another scale to the scale of climate. So Jerry.
Thanks, Clark. Again, my name is Jerry Perez. I'm the Forest Supervisor for the Angeles National Forest. I'm just going to try to give you a kind of a quick overview of the impacts that we're seeing on fires, both within California and here on the Angeles National Forest itself. And hopefully it'll create some dialogue within the chat. Next slide, please. So we have seen more intense fires. To give some perspective, statewide, 6 of the 7 largest fires in California have occurred since 2020. And to give perspective, many of us know about the Dixie Fire, which was almost 1 million acres, and it's still almost contained, but not quite. But quite a significant fire. Last year, it was the Mendocino complex that was well over 1 million acres. To date this year, 8,277 fires have collectively burned 2.35 million acres statewide. And that's across all jurisdictions in California. So you heard earlier about different types of defense areas that we have to protect. And in 2020, for perspective, 2.9 million acres were impacted by the fires there. Besides the impacts to resources, which is one of the concerns that we have as a national forest, is really the tragic loss of personnel, property, as well as lives that have occurred. To date in 2021, approximately 5,100 structures have been impacted by fires. You can also think about the community of Greenville up there where the Dixie fire occurred. Next slide, please. So a lot of these changes result in how do we manage the land on the Angeles National Forest. It has a lot of implications because right now we're about 55% less of normal precipitation. So it really kind of limits and hinders the kind of work we can get done that maybe sometimes we would think about having. It also then creates a lot more concern about wildfires in the national forest. And one of the things that have occurred this past year is a number of forest closures. In fact, the last 2 years, the 18 national forests in California were closed for some period of time, due not just because of the fires, but also because of the capacity that we have of firefighters to be able to work on the land. So the number of fires stretches all of the resources very thin. So the Angeles was closed for a period of about 2.5 to 3 weeks due to those impacts along the way this past year. Next slide, please. So when we think about fires, we think about very much about kind of large catastrophic fires. We think about personal property. We also think about firefighter safety. But there are impacts to historical structures, and as you heard Steve talk about, there are a number of indigenous people who are related, connect to the land here because of cultural resources. And so fire impacts multiple resources along the way. And so we have to think about it from different perspectives, but we always think about first and foremost is public and firefighter safety. We can replace buildings along the way, but we cannot replace lives. But these are important to the cultural heritage of Native Americans and as well as our history. Next slide, please. And this just shows some of the work that we'll be doing during a fire. This is during the Bobcat fire. These are some historical structures that were up in the high country, and so we were trying to get them wrapped before the fire got there. Hopefully, most of the time it works. Sometimes it doesn't, but the goal is to try to protect these historical resources from burning during wildfire season. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we're doing on the land is treating it. You heard Dania talk about some of the things that they've been able to do with the San Bernardino, and we talked a little bit about the Angeles. But these are field treatments up on the Angeles National Forest. The whole goal is to thin out the woods, as Ron talked about a little bit in his presentation, is related to structures, but it's also to be able to get some of the work done on the land, maybe in case a fire comes. We saw some successes with this type of treatment up on Mount Wilson during the Bobcat fire, where a lot of work had occurred in the previous 10 years around Mount Wilson Observatory, and that was able to help our firefighters be able to keep the fire out of the observatory area. So it does have helps protect key assets along the way. And also, Dania talked about the grant that we recently received. It'll allow about $4 million worth of work to be done for fuels reduction, invasive weed abatement, and reforestation projects. So we just can't get this work done by ourselves due to capacity. So working with partners is really key to us. And when I think about this also at the national level, our chief, Randy Moore, is looking at this. How do we create a 10-year strategy around fuels treatment across the nation, all the 193 million acres that the Forest Service manages? Next slide, please. So a few things to think about is we heard a little bit about the law that Governor Newsom signed. For the Forest Service itself, we're looking more and more at what we call shared stewardship. And so we're trying to reach ecosystem restoration and address hazardous fuels. The Forest Service is focusing this shared stewardship and fostering relationships with partners and tribes, state agencies, local communities, and other organizations across all lands. Next slide, which is my final one. Just want to point out that we can see the impacts of climate change. The mega drought is referred to, and the impacts that are having on the national forests. Last year, the Bobcat fire, the Lake fire, the Rower fire, the Ranch 2 fire, and the dam fire impacted about 25% of the Angeles National Forest. But one of the things I do want to recognize is the good work our firefighters do. On average, we get about 12 to 20 starts a week, and we work in collaboration with LA County Fire, Cal Fire, as well as the local jurisdictions, and maintaining and controlling those fires. Usually if the fire gets over 10 acres, I'm notified. Most of these acres are 10 acres or less. So it just is a kind of to recognize the good work that all our firefighters do, as well as our collaborators as we work through all this. So I look forward to some of the questions, and thank you for having me on here. I'll give it back to you, Clark.
Hey, thank you, Jerry. Appreciate that. Next up is Ben Butsic. You may be asking yourself at this point, what can we do to build and retrofit, rebuild sustainably? How do we plan our inhabitation in these wildland areas? And Ben is going to hopefully give us some answers. Ben?
That was great timing. My dog just sprinted off. I thought, where is she going? And my wife is home, so it's all good. Anyway, thanks for having me. This has been a really informative group of presentations so far, and hopefully this will wrap things up a little bit before we get to Q&A. So yeah, what are we going to do about these buoy fires? How can we plan for them? And what's happened in the past? All in 7 minutes. So here we go. Next slide. I think we skipped a slide. Okay, well, I think there was supposed to be one more slide, but maybe it got lost somehow. But that's okay. The slide that was going to be there was gonna only say two main points, which I can verbally say just as well. So in California, when there's a fire, all the houses get rebuilt. We've done a number of studies, and basically within 5 years, about 70% of houses are rebuilt. 10 years later, almost 95% of houses are rebuilt. But what's really interesting, besides that, is that in the area where houses are rebuilt, if you look at that fire perimeter, actually after the fire, 5 years after the fire, in almost every large fire we've looked at, there's actually more structures than there was before the fire. So it's not simply that houses are being rebuilt, it's that new houses are also being built in these same areas that we know are vulnerable. And so why I bring this up is because oftentimes we think about the idea of rebuilding and the idea of new building just being sort of separate. And there's some things that are different about both, but they're actually oftentimes taking place in the same area within the same fire perimeter. So what I'm going to talk about today is some like real simple risk reduction strategies that Max Moritz and I have published an article on. And I just want to mention how I think that while these are built or discussed specifically in the context of new buildings, we can also think about them as something that can also probably affect rebuilding as well. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 4 contexts for risk reduction strategies. The first context is the landscape setting. So this is sort of where did the fire happen, or where might a fire happen, and where are we going to place our houses? And in our guide, we have three main recommendations. The first one is when we've talked to both land use planners as well as fire officials, the earlier people can engage these folks in their development plans, the better. We encourage folks to use the fire hazard maps that are available whenever possible, whenever making your plans. Also suggest folks make use of existing land use features. Next slide. The second context for reducing risk is separation from wildfire sources. And so we talked about this, or Ron talked about this already a little bit, but this includes using non-flammable amenities, employing safe setbacks, such as especially along slopes, and development away from fuels. And there's a few examples of these here. So if we can go to the next slide. This is an example from Southern California that I really like. So this is a planned community. And what's interesting is it's a golf course community, but instead of the golf course being in the middle and the houses being around the golf courses, which is what we usually see, in this case, we see that a lot of the houses are actually surrounded by the golf courses. And this means that there's irrigated green vegetation between the wildlands and the houses. It also makes for really easy access for firefighting personnel. So this is a great way to separate housing from wildfire. Next slide. So here's another sort of simple and interesting example. So this is again in California. And here we have all of the houses are clustered on one side of the road away from the wildlands. So instead of having a road with structures being on both sides of the road, and then you would have one set of houses abutting the wildlands where the wildfire may be coming from, this development planned in a fire smart way. And so they actually have no houses on the side of the road that abuts the wildland. And what this means is that firefighters can easily access the area between the wildland and the houses. So again, just a simple way of setting back the structure so that there's actually distance between where the fire may be coming from and the homes we want to protect. Next slide. And here's another example, and I think it was Ron who touched on this a little bit, but this is an interesting example where you can see in the Google Earth imagery, we have some vegetation clearing going around the houses, but it's not cleared down all the way to bare dirt, but it's higher level of management closer to the buildings, and then sort of progressing into the natural state of things. You get a little bit further from the houses. So this is a community that's done a really interesting job, I think, of trying to find that balance between how you're going to moderate your flammable vegetation while protecting ecosystems as well. All right, next slide. The fourth context for risk reduction strategy is density management. So at what density are we building our homes? And what we found from research all over California, and there's a whole bunch of studies that sort of show the same thing, which is that at really low housing density, so way out in the middle of nowhere where you have one house every 30 acres or every 50 acres or every 100 acres, your risk of wildfire is not so high. There's just fewer people to start fires and fewer structures to burn if there is a fire. And if you're in really dense settings, so if you're in downtown LA, you're probably not that vulnerable to wildfire. Or in the dense suburbs that we saw in the previous slides. But it's this middle area, this WUI development, where you have lots of people to start fires, lots of vegetation to burn, where we see these changes, or where we see the challenges around wildfire. So managing density by clustering homes close to other homes, we think is a winning strategy. And of course, there's lots of other sort of like win-win situations with clustering our housing as well. Greenhouse gas emissions, potentially higher density can lead to lower cost of housing, etc. Okay, next slide. Oh, and this is just a map from a simulation we ran in San Diego County where we simulated housing under infill and expansion type housing developments and sort of looked at the different, and the infill was by far the best scenario here to reduce wildfire. Next slide. So here's an example of this, of a nice housing development in Southern California, where we see the developers building one lot right next to each other. They're not leapfrogging and leaving open space between the properties, even though we know that some homeowners might appreciate that. From a fire perspective, keeping these houses in contiguous blocks of housing is oftentimes what we see as the safest. Next slide. So here we are with the fourth and final recommendation, and this is thinking about protective infrastructure. So one thing we've seen quite a bit in other countries, particularly Australia, is this idea that they harden public facilities of places of refuge. So this is just like a normal, the picture here is just a normal small elementary school in Australia that's been hardened as a place of refuge. So in the event of a large wildfire, if you can't evacuate out of the way of the fire, you can evacuate to a building like this that has been hardened and can act as an area for the community to gather. And we think that there could be some real potential when we're doing upgrades to schools, when we're doing upgrades to hospitals, to incentivize these areas to harden in a way that they can work as an area of last resort. Locating power lines underground where feasible is another one. And then of course, augmenting water requirements so that if you are living in areas where we might have water issues, firefighters are going to have ample water to put out fires. Next slide. That was going to be my first slide. Came in last. Here it is. So basically, this is just the slide saying that you know, everybody's rebuilding, and even within the fire perimeter, there's more houses later on. So thinking about rebuilding and new development together could be a useful way to think about these two approaches. All right, I think that's going to be it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for a lot of material to chew on here. I know we're running, as often happens, right up against our timeline. So I'm going to jump right into the discussion, if appropriate. I'm not seeing any objections from the big moderator. So as moderator, the first one I want to throw out to the panel is a number of the presentations highlighted ignition prevention, and again, that potential combination of habitat connectivity along with ignition resistance and even wildfire discontinuity. So for no particular reason on that question, I'm going to start with David Haas, if you're willing to take that along, but I think a number of you mentioned it and could comment.
Could you restate that question again? I was looking at one of the Q&A questions. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know we've all been trying to go back and forth. And by the way, we'll get some of those questions in here too. The question has to do with some of the, I guess, best management practices that homeowners and land managers in general, or land stewards can do to combine ignition prevention with habitat restoration. I saw that in a few places. Could Dave, if you want to kick that off, or you can?
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. You know, that's an easy question, simple answer. No, I'm just kidding. You know, that is always the challenge, trying to find that balance of maintaining appropriate types and amounts of vegetation to provide those other things that the environment provides for us, while at the same time providing protection for homes. And you know, I think it's just a matter of figuring out what works most appropriately for your property, where you live, the species that grow there, and what your goals for your property are. Even if you only own a quarter acre or something, you know, it's still a matter of developing essentially a management plan for your property, where you say, where do I want to go? Where am I, and what do I need to do to get there? And you can work with your local professionals like Ron or myself, or nonprofits, or any of the people speaking on this presentation, to try to develop that balance of all those considerations. So I hope that was sufficiently vague and specific at the same time.
Well, you mentioned one of the chat's questions is a follow-on to that. You mentioned Ron. So maybe Ron, you could talk about, I think there was and often is a misunderstanding about these distances and what that means. Can you talk more about how habitat can be maintained, its functionality and all the other benefits, its beauty, et cetera, can be maintained closer than 200 feet? Because one of the questions was, if we push everything out to 200 feet, we're going to lose much of our habitat. So could you follow on that and add some nuance?
Great question, and an opportunity to provide clarity. So the 200 feet for LA County does not mean that we're clearing. So there's no fuel in that 200 feet. The area where you don't have fuel is the first 5 feet. And then it starts to progressively increase, but it's very low next to the trucks for first 30 feet, increases a little more. So now you're having shaded fuel breaks, continuities are broken in between, all the way out to 100 feet. And then from about 100 feet to 200 feet, the primary purpose there is to reduce radiant heat, reduce ember cast. So it's not to clear fuels or habitat. The goal again is to reduce ember cast and reduce radiant heat so that we have a good defensible space for firefighters. That's the primary purpose of going beyond that first 100 feet. We're talking about soft skinned firefighters. So all that we really need to do at that point is, if we have grasses, fine fuels, because that's what's going to carry the fire, we need to remove those fine fuels. So you just cut those down, right? Other native things, oaks, toyon, elderberry, all of those things, you just remove the dead, right? And possibly limb up a little bit, right? So now you have habitat that basically stays intact, but you're just reducing fuel a little bit and taking the dead out, reducing that radiant heat. It's not completely denuding the landscape. And that's sort of the misconception. And that's what I showed in that slide that happened in Corral Canyon. They cleared everything but lost their homes, right? They cleared everything but lost their homes, except they lost the part right next to the structure, right? They let everything grow next to the structure. That's completely opposite of what we know as a best management practice. So that's really the goal, is to educate so that we're not denuding everything and keeping habitat intact. And then, working with your neighbors and doing the same thing with them. So thank you, Clark.
Yeah, thank you. Rorie, could you maybe continue on that line of discussion between how habitat connectivity can be integrated with wildfire discontinuity? I know you showed some programs that are actively working on that, and wondered if you had anything to add there.
Yeah, I mean, part of the idea, and clearly it'll take a number of years before oaks and toyans get big enough, but what we were aiming for is to get rid of along the 101 freeway, because that's where,
Rorie, I think, yeah, there you go.
Okay, got remuted myself. Anyway, that the Woolsey fire and all the fires before that, wind-driven Santa Ana, starting in Santa Susana Pass or farther north, and blow all the way across the freeway and down to the ocean. And it's certainly I don't know that we could ever stop that, but the idea is if we get rid of some of at least the mustard and the weedy grasses that are adjacent to the freeway, and then replant or restore with screens of oaks and other fire resistant trees, we may be able to catch some of those embers blowing across the freeway before they head all the way to the ocean. That's basically our premise for this one project. But yeah, for sure. I mean, you have, and I'm glad Ron clarified the fuel defensible space area, because I mean, there are plenty of native species that people can plant in their landscape, and your defensiblespace.org is a great roadmap for that, where we don't want to have denuded landscapes, and the slide showing the clearance at Corral Canyon way beyond, but yet the people had decks and trees right next to the house. That's sort of the classic case. Certainly, I know, like in San Diego County, some of the studies, I can't remember if it was John Keeley and Alex Seifert or Rick Halsey, but somebody went way overboard, 300 feet of clearance, did nothing. But yet some other locations where even eucalyptus trees farther out from the house managed to stop wind-driven embers from reaching the house.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I think that the wind and ember deposition conversation is one that we can continue to have, because again, much of what we see, if not the majority, of course, is not really from direct flame contact. It's from ignition from embers that light something fine, which then moves on and engages structures. But what I'd like to do now is move. There were also questions about on the preventative side. There were a few questions in the chat, and again, maybe a little bit of confusion about the appropriateness of prescribed different treatments, in particular prescribed burns. So I'd like the representatives, Jerry or Dania, of the Angeles Forest region, which is a very different kind of ecosystem type than what we have been talking about in the Santa Monica Mountains, to comment on that. And what are the factors that determine the appropriateness of managed burns, of preventative burn activity?
Clark, so
yes,
prescribed burn is just one of many tools that we have. A lot of our work is being done through mechanized treatment. That's like a machine coming through and grinding it up. And so when we look at kind of the use of the different tools, we go through a pretty lengthy environmental analysis process to consider, what's the appropriate tools on that piece of landscape. So we can do prescribed burning, we can do pile burning. That's where we stack a lot of the wood on the ground into piles. We usually do those in the fall, winter, when it's a little bit safer. And then we do a lot of mechanized treatment. And it all depends on also a lot of things that we call prescription. What's the air quality of the day? We have to check with the air quality board if we can light. So we use different tools, and we try to consider like where it has would have the best effect on the landscape. So it's not something we apply everywhere. It's kind of applied in a thoughtful way. And sometimes we do get what we call out of prescription, and that's where maybe the fire would escape where we were hoping to burn. But it's a limited tool on the Angeles. A lot of that is because of the air quality in the area, and putting smoke up into the air makes it very challenging. Definitely use more of a tool up north, but in the south, I would say maybe a fifth of our proposed work on the land for fuels treatment is through fuels treatment. And like a year like this, we just can't even put fire on the land because it's so dry. And so it's out of prescription for us to even begin to burn. So, so there's, and there I saw perspectives about changing of vegetation type, and that's considered by our botanists and taking a look at where to appropriately place it. So I'll stop there and see if Ron or David or Dania want to add anything else.
Yeah, just Jerry, there's been some in the chat, a request that when you answer, you speak up a little bit. Your volume's a little bit low on your interface there. Great.
I can do that.
Okay. Dania, do you have anything to follow on that? Because, the press and shows the images of and talks about how we should have, and perhaps in hindsight would have had better results if we'd done more burning. Is that appropriate down here? Again, I think Jerry covered a bit of this. So if you want to take it in a slightly different direction, that's fine. But I just want to make sure that we had a chance to comment on your work and its appropriateness.
Yeah, thanks, Clark. Jerry and I are pretty aligned. These are really complex decisions, as he highlighted, and it's just important to note that fire is a part of most of these ecosystems. So we haven't let fire play the role that it needs to in these areas. So where there are opportunities to engage in prescribed fire, where it's safe and ecologically sound, and there's funding, it makes sense to give it a try to kind of help kind of restore these fire regimes that have sustained these ecosystems for thousands of years. We're going to be doing some prescribed burns on the San Bernardino National Forest, but as Jerry mentioned, those windows for actually conducting these burns are getting shorter and smaller and fewer and far between. So, and this is an essential tool for land management. So it's something that, as Jerry described, all of these resource specialists are trying to figure out when to do this, but also how to prioritize which areas actually receive prescribed burns.
Thank you. Thank you. Another line of questions has to do with incentivizing sustainable defensible space. So I'd like anyone who has any thoughts on that to suggest if there are any state or federal incentives or that exist or that you could imagine ought to exist to help property owners to develop and implement sustainable defensible space. It might be on the things you would suggest side as opposed to the existing, but if someone wants to jump in.
I'd say, I mean, a pretty powerful motivator is like defensible space is there to defend, to provide protection for your home. So, you know, to me, that seems like a pretty powerful motivator, you know, whether it works or not, I don't know, but, you know, same thing as I mentioned during my talk, and it's not anything in particular. It's just reminding people that, like I said, your houses catch on fire too, and that fire spreads to the wildland, which affects all the resource issues that we discussed earlier and adjoining properties. So it's reminding people that that defensible space works in both directions, you know, and it's hard to incentivize anybody to do it other than you know, straight up just paying them to paying somebody to have the work done for them. But there are quite a few fire prevention grants that have been administered throughout the state to local fire safe councils and other agencies to provide financial assistance for abatement assistance. Again, focused primarily in SRA, but you know, same thing. You've got to get people to want to do it. And if I wish I knew the answer to that one.
Well, maybe Van, from a planner's perspective, looking at these both rebuilds and new development, you showed a few examples that you thought were good. Any thoughts on ways to harness? I mean, one of the things we notice here when we're looking at defensible space in the wildland urban interface is that although it's not entirely communities of means, that people do have budgets and budget their insurance, their protections, their vegetation treatment. How could we think about harnessing some of that private investment individually more, other than just being a good neighbor, as David suggests, and not setting your neighborhood on fire because your house is vulnerable and becomes fuel? But anything from a planner perspective that you can think of that?
I guess I could give two sort of commentaries on that. One is, you know, a lot of the sort of at the subdivision level, those planning decisions can be strongly influenced by local planning boards, and you know, it's within the jurisdiction of a lot of these boards to make small changes that could have a big difference. And so that's where, you know, we really need planners engaging in these fire safe things early on, right? You don't want to, when the development's planned, that's not the time to say, oh no, you need to have all your houses on the other side of the road. That needs to come early on in these discussions. But I do think there's actually a pretty strong role for planning organizations and CAL FIRE as well, which does some land use planning to be engaged earlier. I would say on the individual property scale, you know, one thing that we've looked into, you know, what programs might work. We do think that the state could fund some type of revolving loan program, which could help people upgrade parts of their houses that are really fire safe or unsafe. So wooden decks, wooden roofs, things like this. There could be a role for the state to help fund homeowners to replace those and make those more fire safe. You know, we also think there's a role for insurance. At this point, it's very difficult to actually know sort of the monetary impact of these small changes. So I think I think everybody here would agree that, you know, if you implement all the defensible space, your house will be safer. But it's hard to say that doing a specific action, keeping your propane tanks 20 feet from your house is worth $5 a year. Like getting on that granular level that is probably what you need to actually like make an incentive program work is just really tough. And I don't think we were able to do that yet.
Okay. Well, good. It's good to have new things to work on. So thank you for that. I'm thinking of programmatic permitting on habitat restoration. You're trying to do good thing. It takes forever. But if you have a type of project that's predefined and meets certain criteria, it happens easily, right? That's a form of incentive. The lawn replacement work, someone had a comment in here about, and this is a slightly separate question, about lawn replacement perhaps leading to ignition and home loss. So we may come back to that. But as an example, those programs were taken advantage of. There's a direct water conservation impact. If private investment leads to public benefit, I'd like all of us to continue to look at how we might do that so we harness benefit rather than asking the state to continually fund and channel through all of us to work on these things directly. I think that the next kind of question type, and by the way, please jump in if you are seeing things in the chat that you really want to address here. But at the watershed level, how would you summarize, and maybe I'll send this back to Rorie again, how local communities can contribute to enhance fire resiliency? How do we make our communities more resilient now that the threat is increasing? What if you were to ask to summarize, what can you all do? What might you throw out there, Rorie? Anybody else?
Well, I mean, house out. I think really, more and more local governments need to do this too. More public information, like the RCDs are doing with the home ignition zone consultation, and fire departments do that too. So I think it is kind of an individual action, but it really does need to be led by local governments and public awareness. And it's people get really freaked out about, like after the Woolsey fire, we had a lot of folks calling the county supervisor saying, there's all that parkland out there. Why aren't you making it all go away? In other words, either I'm not quite sure what that meant, because, you look at the fires like the Tubbs fire, that destruction was mainly within an established community, even though it arose from outside. So a constant battle to make sure everybody knows what the issues are and how to address them. Again, all the resources that, like the county Ron's brochure that Fire Safe Alliance put out, and defensiblespace.org and CAL FIRE, everybody has really good resources, and we just need to make sure more people see them and read them and take them to heart.
Great, thank you, Rorie. I think what we've seen is that consensus building has happened. We've all worked together, and you mentioned the defensiblespace.org. We'll plug that again. That's the most recent effort where everyone sat down, from life safety people responsible for that, planners and ecologists. But why do you think, as a group, this group seems to be good and skilled at consensus building that leads to principles we can agree on? Can you talk a little bit about, since, if you're going to do integrated fire management, you have to integrate and you have to build consensus. And some of these issues appear to be in conflict. And honestly, some of them sometimes are in conflict, from one side to another. Could as a kind of final response, could anyone jump in there about the importance and maybe even some techniques regarding consensus building for communities?
Clark, I'd like to just kind of touch on what you talked about just a second ago about
Sure.
building a watershed level plan. That's probably what's most important. We understand where fire starts, where they go, how they travel, particularly in the Santa Monica's. We know our vulnerabilities. So we need to work on the watershed level plan that has strategic advantage built into it that enhances habitat and provides defensible space. And it's completely doable, right? We already understand how it's going to work. We just need to employ these best management practices that we are already aware of and put them in the right place. And then, like you just said, we have to communicate that to all of the stakeholders so that they really understand what we're trying to do. And the end result is to prevent a Woolsey. I mean, that's the big picture. The end result is to prevent another Woolsey. We're going to get these small fires here and there, right? But the big one is the one we want to really stop, right? You know, just like Jerry said, we have lots of fires that are 10 acres or less that we put out on a regular basis. But when we get conditions like this, the one that we have right now in Santa Barbara, right? Those are the conditions that we're most concerned about because they're the most devastating. And that's where this watershed level plan makes the difference.
Well, I thank you, everyone, for that. I think that's a good place to end, particularly since it's 4 p.m. on the nose. And that's our prescribed stopping point for this part of the conversation. So thanks, everyone, for all the work that you do and for the presentations and thoughts that you presented.
Thanks, Clark. I mean, I thought it was tremendous, a tremendous job of moderating and some really great informed questions. I really appreciate it. And thank you to all the panel members. You all do such important work, and I thought that panel was really well done. We're going to take a 5-minute break so that we can go to the next panel after that and still try to reach our time frame that we're looking to conclude. So we will get together at 4:05 and then start the second panel. And thanks very much. Hope everybody's able to stay to the end.
Thank you.
Okay, we're gonna get started again. And before we go to our second panel, earlier in the program, we had a little bit of a glitch technologically, and we were going to have Sabrina drill with the University of California Cooperative Extension say a few words. She's not only been a frequent collaborator with the council, but been very important to our working relationships, and her depth of understanding on a broad range of geographic, ecological, and social issues related to wildfire and her extensive network of experts has helped us convene diverse perspectives and expertise focused on weather, water, weeds, and wildlife. She was a moderator on the previous program, and she did a great job. And we're hoping, Sabrina, that you're on and you can just share a few words as we continue on with our program.
Hi, thank you, Steve. Yeah, I just wanted to say that it's always such a pleasure collaborating with the council. You may not know this, but I was one of the council's first ever employees back when it was me and Dorothy and not too many others in the office. It's always great to do that. I'm actually going to get a chance to talk a little more about UCANR and our role, the role we played in this symposium and how we manage working with communities and trying to increase fire resilience. But I think the last thing that I want to say is to just kind of, we're not taking a minute necessarily, but just kind of take a moment to send some good thoughts to our fellow Californians who are experiencing fires right now. And I'll pass it back to you, Steve.
Thank you, Sabrina. I really appreciate that. I was just giving it a moment there. And yes, I did become aware that you're one of the first employees. And I did, have kind of a relationship with Dorothy Green because I worked on some other things in the water world that she really cared about and had a lot of interaction with Dorothy. And I know that you and Rumi and others that were kind of the foundation, you all were very special. So thank you very much. So we want to kick off panel 2, and we want to make sure that we keep everybody, online and that you hear all of this. So I'd like to next welcome our next moderator, Michelle Romolini, and Dr. Romolini is the managing director for the Center of Urban Resilience at Loyola Marymount University, and I think they call that CURES. And Michelle, I'm a Lion, so I'm kind of there in spirit with you. Graduated from LMU. Michelle specializes in social scientific research related to urban ecology with main areas of expertise in environmental governance and green infrastructure. And she leads several CURES research programs, including projects related to stewardship networks, free canopy mapping and prioritization, and urban parks and greening. She works closely with faculty at LMU and other universities, the USDA, Forest Service scientists, and nonprofit leaders. And thanks, Michelle, for joining us today and being a moderator. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. This is really exciting. Fire is not my specialty, but I do work on, like you said, on studying how environmental stewardship groups work together and collaborate on a range of topics. So currently one of my projects is funded by the US Forest Service to study environmental stewardship groups and how they network in the LA River watershed. So starting with Angeles National Forest and all the way through the urban areas and the wild urban interface. So this is really exciting to be kind of here and ending the wrapping up the symposium. Thanks for inviting me, and I will introduce the speakers. So first in this panel, we're going to have Rachel Lupo, who's the senior manager at Southern California Edison Wildfire Program. And she'll be followed by David Pedersen, who's the general manager with the Las Virgenes MWD. And then Ben Stapleton, the Executive Director with the U.S. Green Building Council, Los Angeles. Antoine Kunsch, Community Resilience Coordinator for the Resource Conservation District of the Santa Monica Mountains. And then, as we just heard, Sabrina Drill is the Natural Resources Advisor for the Los Angeles and Ventura Counties UCANR. And Fabian Garcia from the Angeles National Forest and San Gabriel Mountains National Monument Partnership Coordinator will wrap up this session, and then we'll go into Q&A. And so I guess we'll just get started. So I'll pass it over to Rachel.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Rachel Lupo. I'm a senior manager with Southern California Edison. We're an investor-owned electric utility. We cover about 50,000 square miles, some of which is located in the LA County and greater area. We serve about 5 million customers. So my day job is to oversee a team of project managers who are responsible for managing all of the work that has to do with our wildfire resilience program. And so on a day-to-day basis, we work in a number of areas throughout the service territory in order to execute that work through our contract and Edison crews. A little bit about my team. They deal with a lot of the agencies that I've heard on here today, as well as a lot of the areas I heard mentioned. Santa Susana State Park, we just did some work in there. Santa Monica Mountains, Los Angeles National Forest. We also were affected by the El Dorado fire, which we had some restoration work done last year due to that. So a little bit about what I'm going to present today. So I'll talk a little bit about the program, how it got started, how we identify the areas that we consider our high wildfire risk areas. And then I'll talk a little bit about our public safety power shutoff program, and then our engagement with our both agency level collaborators, as well as our customer programs that we offer. So first of all, a couple years ago, back when, if some of you are familiar with Senate Bill 901, there was a wildfire resiliency program that was adopted by all of the state utilities. This really enabled us to start a wildfire resilience program, which we set up a number of teams that were responsible for identifying the highest wildfire risk areas within the service territory. So we have a number of experts, industry experts, fire specialists, engineers, data specialists, and scientists who use a number of factors throughout the service territory, including temperature, burn areas, vegetation, and we determine which areas have the highest wildfire risk. And then we target those areas with a number of different mitigation efforts in order to try to mitigate wildfire risk, and then also mitigate the amount and number and impact of outages that we take. So some of these mitigating efforts include the installation of covered conductor, which there's actually a picture of that on the screen. This is really just conductor that we cover with an insulation so that if anything blows into the wires or if those wires slap together, it limits any ignition risk because of those wires. And any poles that we replace also in high fire areas are fire resistant. So again, to negate fire ignition risk within those the new equipment. We also have been installing weather stations so we can get real-time data on what type of weather, how fast the wind is blowing, if stuff is blowing into our wires. And we also do a number of other things, including installing switching devices, which enable us to shorten the length of the outages or take off less customers if we do have to de-energize due to high wildfire risk. We've also worked to update operational protocols so that when we do come into high fire season, we're able to patrol lines, identify risky situations sooner, which has enabled us to, again, protect the infrastructure and mitigate that wildfire risk. One of the things that we launched back in 2019 is the Public Safety Power Shutoff Program, which unfortunately some of you may have experienced in the past, and that is where we actually go out and proactively shut off the power in order to mitigate any type of ignition risk. Obviously, this is a big inconvenience for our customers, but it enables us to make sure that our equipment is staying safe, and we're also not the cause of wildfire ignitions within the service territory. One of the efforts that we've been working on is to try to mitigate the amount of outages that we have to take proactively. And the way that we do this is by identifying the high impact circuits and going out and focusing our wildfire mitigation efforts on those circuits. So by covering circuits, by putting in the fire resistant poles, by adding sectionalizing devices, we can actually minimize the number of outages that we're forced to take and also minimize the impact to our customer population. So this summer we did launch an effort where we accelerated a significant amount of hardening work on those circuits, a lot of which were located in the greater LA County area. And again, really focused on mitigating that customer impact, but still ensuring that our equipment is not a wildfire risk. So again, the goal of that program is to remove them from getting shut off and then also to minimize the amount of disruption because of those power shutoffs or power outages. You can go to the next slide, please. So another thing that we've really been focused on is our community outreach. And so working with local, county, state agencies, private agencies, environmental groups, not only to get the work done that we need to do to mitigate wildfire effects, but also to communicate what we're doing within the communities, how we can partner to make our equipment more safe, and then also, again, just to provide transparency around, what the utility is offering. We, again, work with those local officials during not only response efforts, emergency efforts, we'll, attend emergency operations centers, but we also work with them during normal day-to-day to make sure, again, that we're communicating all of our efforts in a very transparent method. We do a lot of consulting with community members. We work with tribal governments. We try to get information out if we are in an event so that communities know what is going on and why they may be affected. Some of the things that we've recently launched is community crew vehicles. So we will dispatch these to remote locations if customers are experiencing shutoffs, so they have somewhere to go charge their phones. We have community resource centers, again, that can be staffed. We list those hours and day shifts so that people are aware that they can go and attend a resource center if they are in the middle of an outage. And then we also have resiliency zones where we supply backup power generation at certain essential sites in some of the more remote communities where they may not have anywhere to go. As you can imagine, COVID has definitely intensified people's necessity to have power, as most of us are working from home. So there's been a lot of work to collaborate with the communities and make sure that we're offering support during emergency events or just during times where we have to proactively shut off the power due to those high wind events. And then next slide. And then the last thing I'll talk about is just our outreach to our customer base. So again, we serve over 5 million customers just within the service territory and varying needs. And so we've identified myriad ways to contact them, to get information out, to share what we're doing within the community. Some of you, if you live in the greater LA community, you may have received Dear Neighbor letters where we explain the work that we're doing in the community and why you may be experiencing an outage. We do explain a lot around our wildfire mitigation work and why this work is important for the safety of the community. And then also when we do have, again, emergency events, make sure that the customers know why they're out, when they'll be put back, and putting those emergency response protocols into place. We engage a lot with local fire and police. Again, as I mentioned before, we will dispatch people out to the Emergency Operations Center. We have fire liaisons that work with the local fire departments if there is an active fire that is affecting our equipment or our equipment is potentially in the path of the fire. We do collaborate on many levels across the board. And then just, again, on a day-to-day basis, a lot of the work that my team does is working out in the community and making sure, again, that we have clearance to do the work. We're identifying the right areas to mitigate and collaborating with the communities that we serve. And that is all that I had. So look forward to any questions that you have. And I think my contact information is probably shared within the speaker packet. So feel free to reach out to me as well if there's any questions you have offline about any of the work that we're doing or any of our community or customer partnerships.
Thank you, Rachel. We'll move on to David.
Hi, thank you, Michelle. Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, Clark. Good to see you. My name is Dave Pedersen. I'm the general manager of Las Virgenes Municipal Water District, and I'm going to give you a quick overview of some of the lessons we learned as a water utility during wildfire, and then probably more importantly, some of the things that we think will be helpful in terms of building more resilient water systems in the future so that we can be better prepared. And this photo right here is taken from the balcony outside my office during the Woolsey fire. Next slide. So we're a water and wastewater agency serving the Conejo and Las Virgenes valleys. We are a member agency of Metropolitan, and we have a pretty large service area, about 122 square miles. Next slide. So the Woolsey fire is really the fire that sort of we cut our teeth on learning about response and the things that worked and didn't. This map shows the outline of our service area in blue, and you can see also the burn area from Woolsey, the Woolsey fire, the point of origin in Woolsey Canyon, which is near the Santa Susana Field Lab. And what you can see is it burned towards the coast and burned ultimately 2/3 of our service area by land. Next slide. So I've got a couple slides here, and we'll go through them quickly that just show photos and some of the damage. But I wanted to highlight a couple things. This is our Rancho composting facility. We had some fire damage there. On the left, what you'll see there is you'll see the roof burning, but what you see is unfortunately poor housekeeping. And so we had some wood chip piles that are used in the process, and those were stored near the building and they catch on fire. So I think we heard earlier about defensible space and how important that is. And this is, unfortunately for us, an example of what can happen if you don't really take care of that. On the right is what we call our biofilter burning. Next slide. Our Westlake filter plant, this building actually it caught fire 3 different times during the fire. And it burned not entirely, but the outside arcade and the chemical room. Next slide. Just a couple of the hazardous conditions that you encounter. We had bridges like this one on Mulholland Highway that were damaged and failed, water mains that broke, and of course power lines that were down. Next slide. And then, of course, some of the destruction just of personal property and homes. Next slide. So this is really sort of the summary of the lessons we learned through the fire. And I'll just go through them very quickly because time is short, but investing in backup power for a water utility is really, really important during fire. We lost power to almost every facility in our district during the Woolsey fire, and that happened very quickly. It happened the following morning. The fire started in the afternoon. On a Thursday, by Friday morning, we had lost power to nearly every facility. Activating early, and what I call apologizing later. None of us want to pull the trigger on activating our emergency operations when it's not necessary, but the fact is a lot of times you don't know whether it's necessary or not. And so being quick and being willing to activate early is critical to responding. Water personnel, we are first responders. We're not police and fire by any stretch, but we do have a role in being first responders. And so we did learn also what comes with that. And really, it's important to be safe and to watch out for our own personal safety and our employees. When the fire came, everybody wants to pitch in and help. But one of the key things is to send people home, because you need to be able to have people who are well rested who can come in and relieve you. So we ran 12-hour shifts. Chaos is actually pretty normal in an emergency, but you really need to do your best to manage it, and we did do that. Mutual aid is a powerful tool, but mutual aid is something that you need to call for before you actually need it, because by the time you need it, it's too late and it can't get to you in time. And then the others are related to documentation, FEMA, testing emergency generators. This is something more important before to have those generators tested and be sure that they're ready to go. During the actual fire incident, it's important to send a representative to incident command, and that individual will be the person in contact with what's called the incident command liaison officer. And that officer is the most important person for your agency because they can help you and help protect your facilities when needed. And then in terms of updating and communicating, which is kind of the theme of your second session here, is issuing the public notices and doing it without delay. And I'll tell you, there are times where you feel anxious about some of the notices that you need to issue, like a boil water notice, where you're telling your customers that the water may not be safe to drink. But it's really important to just put those out there and feel confident that you're doing the right thing by getting the most up-to-date information to the people that need it. And then last is that the emergency response is very much a sprint. There's a lot of adrenaline, but the disaster recovery is a marathon or a century run, if you like. You really need to pace yourself and you need to be willing to put in the time that's needed. So I have one more slide, and if you switch here, looking really ahead, what's required to have a resilient water system? And the little sprout there in the ground is kind of intended to represent that. I mentioned redundancy, so having backup power and backup power that can switch over automatically. So automatic transfer switches is really important. Hauling generators in the middle of a fire is difficult. As is hooking them up. So if you have those generators already and you have switch gear where they can immediately flip over and start up on their own, that's really, really helpful. Connecting with your neighbors. So having interconnections with your neighboring water systems is valuable, and that gives you a level of redundancy to supply water. More gravity storage is better. So pumping during a fire is difficult, and if you have power, it interrupts that. So having water stored at elevation that you can feed down by gravity is really helpful. And then looping your distribution system. So having opportunities where you can move water around an area where you have a break, and that way you don't isolate or cut off an area. Mutual aid agreements, and there's a lot of opportunity out there to join these are really helpful. Doing your emergency response planning and having practiced emergency drills before an actual event happens is really helpful. Fuel becomes an issue. So once you're in an emergency and a major disaster, you need to be able to fuel your systems, especially generators. And so being able to access fuel is important, diesel fuel, and being able to pump it. So having backup systems so you can pump it out of your fuel tanks and having tenders that you can run it out to get it to where it's needed. The routine maintenance and testing of equipment is really important. That's what helps to ensure that that equipment doesn't fail when you need it and when you need to count on it. And then having your emergency contracts with vendors. And you need vendors that you can count on, people that you know that when you call them, they can actually deliver and bring you the things that you need to do your job. And then, consistent with what Rachel told us all, of improved communication with our power representatives. For us, that's Edison, is really, really important. Knowing who they are and having a relationship with those individuals. And then last but not least is having really well-trained employees who know their job, they know what needs to be done, and they're familiar with the function and the operation of the water system. Thank you. Back to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Dave. I'm sorry that this is the reason that you're giving this presentation, but what an incredible list of lessons learned and a lot of thought about how to move forward and planning for the future. So our next speaker is Ben Stapleton.
Thank you, Michelle, and it's great to be here today. And I want to say just thank you to everyone who's been participating and the service and work by all the folks here from our fire prevention community. I've grown up here in Southern California, and I can't say enough how much we appreciate the work you do. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can really collaborate with the fire prevention community and our other local nonprofit partners to leverage the green building industry, the green building community, the sustainability movement amongst real estate to help accelerate fire-wise development and fire prevention here in the greater LA region. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of background. So my name is Ben Stapleton. I'm the Executive Director for the U.S. Green Building Council Los Angeles. We are affiliated with the national organization that runs the LEED credential and certification that you may know, but we're independent and we're really focused on leveraging the built environment to create a more sustainable region for all here in Southern California. What does that mean? That means that we can develop more localized programming, certifications, training, things that really can benefit us here in Southern California that maybe be more specific to our needs, such as issues around fire prevention. Next slide, please. So to give you a sense of what goes into the green building community, the LEED certification is, and I'll show you some data here in a moment, is the world's largest leading certification around buildings, but we really touch folks in all aspects of real estate. So whether it's planning, construction, architects, engineers, folks at municipalities, at our local utilities and other agencies, folks at universities. So our community is really diverse. And again, the linkage here is all folks who care about sustainability in buildings. We really want to get that community involved in this discussion and really create a cultural change where sustainability means to them that's including reducing wildfire risk, that's including taking into account these fire prevention strategies that are proven out and implementing those into the work that they're doing. Next slide, please. So to give you a sense of what this community looks like, there's over 80 million square feet of LEED certified buildings here in the region, almost 30,000 certified LEED professionals. There's consistent growth year on year in these certifications and with these professionals. There's also a variety of different certifications that have come up. We don't necessarily specifically focus on one or the other. We support other certifications such as Envision, the Sites Initiative. These certifications are mechanisms that people are looking to really put a stamp on their real estate portfolios, their properties, the places they live and work, that they're achieving certain standards. And this has become more important as we're seeing this rise in corporate ESG. And we want to leverage that as we work to reduce fire risk. Next slide, please. There we go. Wait, go back one more. Thank you. So how have we ended up at this place here? Really began for us very naturally. Post the Thomas and Woolsey fires, we started hosting workshops with folks who had lost their homes, look at how to rebuild in a more sustainable manner. We did one-on-one consulting with those groups and helped connect them with resources. We collaborated with the Theodore Payne Foundation on some of their tours. And that really led to us building up a group of folks within our community that were focused on reducing fire risk and starting that process for us. Next slide, please. Last year, we really wanted to elevate our outreach here around this issue. We hosted a webinar around best practices around home hardening and landscape design. We started doing some tours, which we have done virtually as the pandemic has hit, and then really integrated a lot of programming into our Municipal Green Building Conference and Expo, which this year was actually our 20th year, but in 2020 is our 19th year. We have about 1,300 attendees at this conference every year. And again, we really want to get the folks who are advising people who are building buildings, our folks that are big construction companies, or folks that are city agencies, around these practices to reduce fire risk, and that as they look to green their portfolios, they're including those as well. Next slide, please. Earlier this year, we hosted a quote unquote mini conference. We really wanted to bring together this fire prevention community and our green building community. We had virtual tours from across the state. A lot of the speakers today participated, and we're grateful for their time, energy, and effort. All the videos for that are available on our website. And there's some great ones there, especially some of the folks who presented today, showcasing different actual products in homes or in showcase sites or different landscape strategies. We want to continue this practice of really highlighting regional tours. We think there's no substitute for folks seeing something in practice and getting out there and really kicking the tires to better understand how to implement these things on their projects or on their buildings. But this is a great opportunity for us to really activate these communities together. Next slide, please. We're doing something similar here, actually just next week. We're doing a deep dive in some issues in the Inland Empire. We're going to hear from some of our local fire prevention folks with San Bernardino County Fire, and then do a deep dive on the Wildwood community in Yucaipa. I'll put the link here into the chat for the event, but we'd love to have folks come out for that. Our goal here is really to show some diverse perspectives on how to reduce fire risk and highlighting those in the Inland Empire. We also want to dive into the issues around private property abutting public land. This has come up for us more and more in our outreach and as people are doing design, maintenance, and planning around their buildings. And we also really want to highlight the stories of residents who are doing the good work. We're also going to have breakouts at this where people can actually talk to some of the experts to learn more about what they can do to directly reduce that risk. Next slide, please. Where do we go from here? Why are we all doing all this? We really want to help create a certification on a local level around wildfire defense for contractors and for landscapers. We've submitted grants for a couple years in a row now to CAL FIRE. We're hoping one of these years they're going to say yes to help us stand this up. But we really want to engage the private sector, and in conjunction with providing training for contractors and landscapers, we want to give them, marketing toolkits, help them sell themselves when they're bidding on a job, so that folks understand, hey, I'm getting a bid from a contractor to help retrofit my house. I've got a bid here from one contractor, and I've got a bid here from another who's certified as a wildfire defense contractor. I'm going to go with that because I live in a fire-prone area. So I think we lean a lot on policy. We lean a lot on the stick to help drive adoption of a lot of these things. We really want to get the private sector motivated and realizing they can make more money if they get educated and can better protect their clients' properties and homes. And so that's the mission we're on right now. And we're actively seeking funding to really help us launch this and stand this up and really engage that green building community and that structure to roll out these kinds of certifications. Next slide, please. In conjunction with the event we're having next week, we're also releasing a toolkit. Really, this is just building on the resources that are already out there. There's a lot of good information out there. We want to make sure we're sort of pointing people to the right places. And it includes a lot of things that folks have talked about today, whether that's defensible space or fire-resistant landscape. But we really try to consolidate those into the toolkit, which we'll be releasing next week following the event. Next slide, please. And I also want to encourage folks who are at this event. There's a number of trends that are happening right now in the green building movement that I think can really benefit what we're trying to do here to reduce fire risk. There's a huge movement right now around transparency in materials, looking at low carbon materials, looking at the manufacturing process for materials, using something called EPDs, which is sort of an ingredient list on how things are made and where they're made, looking at localization of materials. I think that can really benefit some of the discussion here around home hardening. Smart homes, so indoor and outdoor air quality sensors, people really getting a sense of what the air is like both outside their home and inside their home, and how fire is actually impacting that in a big way. We've also seen some interesting technologies around smart homes and fire suppression and sprinkler systems and irrigation to reduce fire risk. So I think we're only going to see these trends continue, and that can really benefit reducing fire risk overall. Energy, there's been some of that discussion today around backup power, microgrids. The more we can increase efficiency and lean into net zero policy and energy, basically energy redundancy for a lot of our communities, that's just going to help us long term. That's already being driven right now by a lot of the trends, and that's making people more aware of their own ability to be more resilient in the face of fire. And then health, if we've learned anything, we've learned a lot, hopefully, from this pandemic. But one of the things we've learned is that we're all more aware of the environments that we're in. And the truth is that indoor air quality is often 3 to 5 times worse than outdoor air quality. We've got materials that are off-gassing. We've got poorly maintained ventilation systems. We're really on a mission to help create more awareness around occupant health. We've submitted for some grants recently around putting indoor air quality sensors in a lot of these communities in the WUI and in low-income areas and multifamily housing to raise that awareness. And so as people get more aware, we really want to integrate that with reducing fire risk, and these things are all connected. The more we reduce fire risk, we're reducing impacts to our health long term as well. Next slide, please. So that's really it for me. I'm like I said, I'm a native here. This issue is incredibly important to me. We really want to engage the green building community with the work you all are doing our community is the architects, the engineers, the contractors, the folks who are there actually, building these buildings that are in harm's way. They're just not culturally adapting yet the things they need to do to make a difference. We want to help create that cultural adaptation or adoption, I think is probably a better word. Here's my contact information if you want to reach out to us. I'm going to drop the link here into the chat for our event next week, and just really appreciate the time today and looking forward to connecting with the rest of the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. And I think that cultural adaptation isn't such a bad term. Thinking about ways that we want to start, thinking differently about development, and especially in Southern California, where we have such a heavily developed landscape, the work you do is just really important. So thank you. And on to our next speaker, we're going to have Antoine Kunsch.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Antoine Kunsch, and I'm the Community Resilience Coordinator for the Resource Conservation District of the Santa Monica Mountains. Today, I'm going to be presenting about some local programs that we have, kind of like tying up together all that we've heard already about defensible space, home hardening, and really taking a look at the local scale, what we see when we do site evaluations and what can be done as the next step. Next slide, please. So the effort in community resilience at the RCD started really focusing on guidance for sustainable defensible space landscaping in the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. We worked a lot with National Park Service and in Southern California as a whole. So it's really ecosystem focused and place-based. Our goals are to reduce the risk of ignition, really understand the causes and reduce it either, for example, if it's from embers, direct or indirect, we want to understand how the landscape and how the structures are getting ignited. Restoring and maintaining resilient landscape across the Santa Monica Mountains. We all know this is a very sensitive habitat, and we want to find that balance that has been mentioned during the first panel between wildfire safety and habitat conservation and preservation. And finally, creating fire-adapted communities. And that's really the power of our community engagement programs, where we are trying to go enter a community with a few local heroes, a few people that are really well-educated around the issues, and rallying the community around those issues to make a bigger impact. And all of those, we mentioned the website, and I'll dive into it a little bit more about defensiblespace.org with all the best practices that have been published there a year ago now. Next slide, please. So I think people here are all too familiar with the footprint of the Woolsey fire that happened in 2018, where despite decade-really long efforts to improve community safety and reduce wildfire losses at state and local levels, the Woolsey fire still burned more than 86,000 acres and destroyed or damaged almost 2,000 homes and killed 3 people. If you can click next, please. So according to the Woolsey fire after action report, the Woolsey structural losses were not really caused because the fire behaved any differently that fires have in the past in that region. It's mostly because previously identified problems were still present regarding landscaping or structural vulnerability. And that's really what we're trying to address, that failure to adequately scale those programs to make our community safer. Next slide, please. So this is a satellite view of a community in Malibu near Malibu High School before the Woolsey fire, so in December 2017, where you can kind of see the type of structure, the kind of landscape that they have. And if you go to the next slide, and here is like not even 2 months after Woolsey fire, where you can see the devastation in that community, and where you see homes that have been destroyed, some homes that survived, some homes that have been partially damaged. But the question that we have here is that, how can we understand the cause of ignition? It's really always difficult to find the cause of ignition after an event. And we're trying to understand here what caused them before our program. So click next, please. And another time. So here we have like the main causes of ignition that we all know and are too familiar with: direct flame impingement, when you have the fire front that is actually at the community, radiant heat, and windborne embers, which can be direct ignition or indirect if it is igniting, for example, the landscape that is then making its way to the structure. Next slide, please. And that's really what we're trying to do, is to identify home vulnerabilities before the wildfire events happen. Next slide, please. So to answer that question, we designed a program that we call the Home Ignition Zone Evaluation Program that we build up to scale through a grant by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. A home ignition zone evaluation is a 45 to an hour review of the vulnerability of the house, so the envelope, the structure itself, and the landscape to wildfire and ember ignition. Like we know embers are the cause of more than 50% of structure ignition, structure damage and destruction in LA County. So it's really a point of focus when we do those evaluations. During this assessment, a trained evaluator that can be staff from the RCD or trained volunteer, all the volunteers go through at least a 1.5 day training and several evaluations where they shadow people who have been trained before. When we do a review of the defensible space and home hardening principles, some of them that have been mentioned previously. We make specific recommendations for the property. It's very site specific. You've seen some diagrams in precedent presentations. We have a lot of different topography, a lot of different landscape across the Santa Monica Mountains. So it's very important to be as site specific as we can. We discuss sustainable fire-wise landscaping using California native plants, because our goal is really to find that balance between habitat conservation, habitat preservation, and wildfire safety. At the end of that report, at the end of this evaluation, homeowners get a report that really identified the top 5 priorities for them to address to reduce the risk of ignition on the property. Next slide, please. So we review really everything from the structure to the landscape. And here I selected a few photos that kind of like show you what we can see on evaluation and what we can point out. I think the first one here about the vent and the protection of the vent is really important. This house was well maintained, but you can see the attic vent that they have there. And I've been on site where a house has been destroyed for the exact same condition. There was a palm tree a few feet away from the structure. The palm tree caught fire, generated embers that went through the attic vents, and the structure caught fire. So this is a kind of this is the example of what we point out during our evaluation, and that include remarks about vegetation overhang that are in direct contact with the structure, or where we have complex roof situation like on the right side. Next slide, please. We also look at under-eave construction and the first 5 feet around the home that are very often critical. Those are very often listed at the very top of priorities for homeowners. Next slide, please. This is the type of report that homeowners get at the end of the evaluation. So the full report is about, I think it's 3 pages, where we go feature by feature. We leave nothing on the side. But because it's really important for homeowners to get a sense of priorities, we don't just leave them with a list of like 20 boxes and then they have to figure it out on their own. We give them the detailed report, but we really highlight the priorities at the very end. Next slide, please. So here's where we are. We launched a program about a year ago. We've done close to 180 evaluations throughout the Santa Monica Mountains. And you have the list of communities here on the slide. So from Maguro Hills, Calabasas, Eden Hills, some in the city of Los Angeles itself, Oak Park, Topanga, and which is the heart of our district, Westlake Village. We really target multiple communities. Click next, please. So 180 evaluation, 17 communities, and you can see some cluster on the map. And those need to be noted because that's what happened when we have a local hero that can rally a community. And that's when we can have a community impact, a community scale impact. Next slide, please. Those are some visualization of like the early data we have from a year of the program, a year in. Those are the vulnerabilities, most common vulnerabilities to wildfire in Topanga. So we've done about 44 evaluations in that area. And if you click next, maybe 4 times, we will see light up on the slide. So here they are. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and one more. There you go. So here's like the top 5 vulnerabilities in Topanga. The first one being the vents that are not properly mitigated. Number 2, we have these amber resistant zone, those first 5 feet that we call the zone 0. Vegetation in zone 1 that in Topanga can be sometimes overgrown. And then it goes down the list with accessory structures or condition of fences running around properties. Next slide, please. This is the same kind of data for Westlake Village, so very different community. Click next. And we get a somehow different set of vulnerabilities. Events, always number 1, which is interesting to note. But then we have under-eave construction that didn't appear in Topanga. Zone 0 is still there in second place, but this is really to highlight the kind of information that we're trying to get from different communities and create a profile for each communities to list the most common vulnerabilities and address them in future grant applications and hopefully grant-funded programs. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip that one together. Those were the top 5 priorities for the entire set of data that we have for now. But it's very similar to what we've seen in Topanga and Westlake Village. I'm happy to dive more into it later. Next slide, please. What we do to offer mitigation solution for homeowners is circling back with the website that has been mentioned before at the beginning of that presentation, defensiblespace.org. Next slide, please. This website was really an effort to create best practices with a very large array of stakeholders. We had California State Park, we had the Ventura County Fire Department, Los Angeles County Fire Department, the National Park Service, many people who are on this symposium participated in the creation of that webinar, including Sabrina, who will be speaking after me, I believe. Next slide, please. And some information that can be found is really very visual. We have a lot of diagrams. We have a lot of tools that can be helpful for homeowners feature by feature. This is the section about home hardening. If you go to the next slide, you have a section about landscape. I'm sorry about the quality here, but it's also going zone by zone to give homeowners clear guidelines on how to upgrade, or to create or upgrade their landscape. Next slide. We also have the same kind of information for community, especially in areas where there's some overlap between property lines with defensible space going to 100 feet or 200 feet, depending on the conditions, and giving some help with homeowners about what they should be doing and how they should be coordinating with their neighbors and their community at large. Next slide. And I just wanted to finish with acknowledging that the funding from that website that you saw, defensiblespace.org, was coming from CAL FIRE and the California Climate Investment Program. Next slide. And that is all the information that I had for you. I will put my information in the chat box, and I'm happy to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Antoine. What a rich set of resources for homeowners, particularly those evaluations. They're so detailed, and I can imagine that they're extremely useful for folks. So our next speaker is Sabrina Drill. And Sabrina, I will pass it to you.
Thank you. So I hope you'll all indulge me a little bit as I kind of bring you into my thought process after a career spent working to a large degree on fire issues. I have kind of started to think about things more from an overall disaster lens, and not just fire resilience, but overall community resilience. Next slide. So what does that mean? It means several different things. So building fire resilient communities is similar to helping any community adapt to changing conditions and disasters. There's steps involved, right? Engaging with the community and really starting to form those relationships is a good place to start. And it hopefully involves a community-wide conversation, or at least one that the community is aware of. Then we need to think about planning, both the emergency planning and fire planning, but overall land use planning as well, as Van mentioned, and some of the other speakers mentioned earlier, and throughout the symposium. Certainly we talked about it last week, or at our last session a couple of weeks ago as well. And then taking real steps to prepare and maintain preparedness, enduring the event and recovering from it, hopefully in a way that reduces inequity and strengthens communities. I want to point something out that I am completely guilty of, and that is that a lot of our discussion about fire resilience and fire safety focuses on homeowners. And most of the homeowners in the wildland urban interface areas of Southern California are relatively wealthy. And I think it's really important that we start thinking about some of the more vulnerable elements of our communities, and how fire, you know, from the individual's point of view, it's one threat that they need to worry about, while thinking about all of the other issues, right? So, you know, something that I started working on last year is how do we manage emergency shelters in a pandemic, whether they're for fire or other situations. It just kind of harkens back to one of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which is to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Next slide. So some of the ways that UCANR has supported kind of fire preparation and community preparation in many communities. We've helped neighbors and organizations form into fire safe councils. You heard from Van a little bit earlier about our work at the regional land use arena. We conduct a lot of the research on structural materials and design considerations to make homes more ember resistant. And it was actually our research that led to a lot of the specific changes in Building Code 7A. And then we assess what worked and what didn't after fire events. We work on these things. I'm just sort of the tip of a large iceberg of expertise, I guess, in UCANR. But we work across the state and throughout local levels to extend science-based information, especially about near home landscaping. And I really want to thank our amazing volunteers. And it was really heartening to sort of hear Antoine talk about the role for volunteers in Topanga, and just thank especially our master gardeners for the work they've done in this area. And one example I just want to point out that we did, it was successful, but at the end of the day, it wasn't necessarily feasible economically. With the Safer Landscapes Project, the Sustainable and Fire Resistant Landscapes Project, that was an earlier collaboration with the Council for Watershed Health and many of the agencies represented here today and throughout the symposium: National Park Service, LA and Ventura County Fire Departments, California Native Plant Society, Cal IPSI worked with us on this as well. But one of the things that we did is we thought about this as a dual mission of increasing community resilience and preventing the introduction of invasive weeds. And one way we tried to integrate this into daily life is by realizing that not everybody is going to be able to attend the workshops and symposia like these. And as others have pointed out, we've known about a lot of these vulnerabilities for a long time, but we're not quite moving to action. This may be a small piece, but we decided to initially put out our information as a calendar so that it was divvied up into sort of 12-month, here's one thing you can do in 1 month. And, that idea of like not making a giant task insurmountable, but breaking it down into achievable steps. Next slide. During the incident, and a lot of these elements really relate to, I'm sorry, previous slide. Nope. Yeah, during the incident, and a lot of this is about preparation and setting things in place, as Dave mentioned earlier, before the event, so that it can be kind of endured. We developed a disaster guide, and While that is somewhat internally focused within our cooperative extension offices, one of the things that we're trying to do is make all of our county CE offices a unit within local communities that can help during disaster incidents and be a trusted source of information. We're also starting to work more in the area of the impacts of fire preparation, such as helping communities prepare for and safely experience public safety power shutoffs. And this is, I think Dave did a great job of pointing out some of the issues related to not having power when you're a water agency. But, one of the things that I personally experienced in living in Ventura during the Thomas Fire is that in a lot of our coastal communities, we don't have air conditioning. And so heat impacts are going to be increasing with and without fire. And there's certainly an interaction there. We need to think about how we can get people into cooling centers during power shutoffs and during fire events. With our wealth of experience in animal agriculture, we played an important role in helping to protect livestock and pets during fire. And in many events, including in the Thomas Fire, our 4-H participants have had an opportunity to be young leaders in this arena by helping with animal care at shelters. And finally, as Julia, Vansel, and Kim pointed out a couple of sessions ago, we're also involved in helping offsite communities. And often these are those vulnerable communities that we're talking about deal with the impacts of smoke and particulates, whether it's personal safety, whether it's food safety related directly to smoke and contaminants, or whether it's food safety related to the lack of refrigeration. Next slide. And finally, integrating fire into community life in the recovery phase of these incidents. So we have extensive resources that help landowners evaluate their forests, rangelands, and vineyards after a fire throughout the state. In Southern California, where we don't have a lot of, or at least in LA, where we don't have a lot of agriculture currently, we have resources, to help oak owners determine whether their tree might survive. We work to understand the impacts of fires on soils and what that means for land and water resources, as Toby O'Gene presented at our first session, and work closely with groups like the Natural Resource Conservation Service and RCDs to help communities manage erosion after fires. And also sort of preparing within recovery, we've been working with the Army Corps of Engineers and Department of Water Resources through the Silver Jackets program that Jeremy talked about, and using the Flood After Fire toolkit to develop scenario-based planning exercises that can strengthen community capacity to respond to post-fire flood events. We've created resources on recovering in ways that make the landscape more resilient, such as promoting sort of build back better ideas into watersheds in Santa Barbara County, using green infrastructure and nature-based solutions to reduce flood and mudslide risk, while still making sure there's habitat value in those watersheds. And of course, we do research and extension work on post-fire invasive weed management that Chris McDonald discussed. Finally, we've used expertise. This is a project of mine to promote fire and climate resilience. An example being a collaboration I did with Surfriders Ocean Friendly Gardens program to tailor some of their materials for burned landscapes and for landscapes in high fire hazard areas. Again, that was after the Thomas Fire. Next slide. And this is my last slide. And I kind of want to just come back to that theme about overall resilience. So we really need to think about fire, but we also need to think about drought, and we need to think about heat events and kind of all of these interrelated issues that that climate changes in climate are just going to exacerbate. But we need to think about sort of the social side of resilience as well. So, how does some of these fire issues and determining where to rebuild and how to rebuild, how does that interact with our need for affordable housing and our housing crisis in the state? And then how do we deal with food insecurity for families who are experiencing a lack of housing, whether it's temporary because they're in a shelter or because their home burned, or whether they didn't have a home to begin with. But we're no stranger to that idea in Southern California. I mean, we know that every square meter of our watershed needs to provide multiple benefits. So how do we think about places where we can increase fire safety, reduce carbon footprints, and increase carbon sequestration? And I'll just leave you with maybe a hopeful note. So several years ago, we launched a program called California Naturalist, and Dania well knows that we've been using that program to help increase the skills and environmental knowledge of folks in community conservation corps and workforce development programs, and especially to target getting some of this information into the hands of BIPOC communities. And we followed that up with a second educational program called Climate Stewards. And this is the book for that, but that's really about how do we build a sense of community and build that cultural resilience while we're also trying to build ecological resilience. And that is my last slide. So I'll hand it back to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Sabrina. You're ending on you're speaking my language at the end there. Just that combined social ecological resilience and how can we think about all of this in a holistic way. I think that cooperative extension has such an important role to play in that and connecting the science with the community. So I really appreciated that, your presentation. And we're going to turn it over to Fabian Garcia from Angeles National Forest.
Hello, hope everyone can hear me okay. Greetings to everyone. Good to see Sabrina again. My name is Fabian Garcia. I'm the partnership coordinator for the Angeles National Forest, which is situated on the ancestral homelands of the Tongva, Quiche, and Tataviam indigenous peoples. I worked for Jerry Perez. He was on the previous panel, so just wanted to give him a shout out. And also a congrats to Jay and Marti on their retirement, 2 leaders that no doubt have accomplished a lot in this field. We salute you and congratulations. I'm sure we'll meet again, probably out in the field somewhere. I'm here today to review our strategy for improving resilience on the national forest landscape by taking a more inclusive stance on what we like to call shared stewardship. The wonderful images you'll see on my slides come from an excellent video produced by our U.S. Forest Service National Partnership Office and Public Affairs Department that kind of covers this, much of what I'll be presenting today. You can find this link in the resource section of the Wildfire Symposium website. So feel free to go back there and review this as many times as you'd like. Next slide, please. So shared stewardship. What we're really talking about is cross-boundary collaboration, inclusive partnerships. The last slide showed nonprofits, state, federal, tribal, and even private partners. And so hopefully today you'll get a little bit of an idea of how, just how does the U.S. Forest Service, the federal agency, accomplish that. So the first way we do that is through the authorities that are granted to us by Congress to enter into partnership agreements. And so I'm going to keep this talk pretty high level, just to kind of set the table for future partnerships amongst our organizations. So for each of our cooperative agreements, we must meet the requirements of the law that authorizes the U.S. Forest Service to work cooperatively. And by working cooperatively, I mean sharing funds, resources, authorizing work on the land, and just collaborating. We have to have a document in place that authorizes that. And oftentimes, the authorizing language, the law that's granted to us by Congress. I won't get into the details of what each law says, but there is, again, a resource, a brochure in the Wildfire Symposium website that you can dig in a little deeper. But I do want to call out two specific authorities that were granted to us recently. One is the Good Neighbor Authority, which focuses primarily on our work with state, county, and tribes. And that gives us a 10-year window to work together. Most of our partnership agreements are usually 5-year agreements, which for landscape projects, you know, can sometimes be a tight timeline. We also have a new authority called the Stewardship Authority that's been granted to us to work with nonprofits, state, county, and tribes for 20-year marks. And these primarily have a lot to do with forest health and wildfire resilience and fuels reduction. So I wanted to really call out the 3 key principles that drive shared stewardship for the U.S. Forest Service, and they are written there. So it's work at scale, cross-boundary solutions, and joint priority setting. So a lot of what we're doing at the policy level, at the state level or regional level in our case, and even at the local level is with that in mind. Next slide, please. Okay, and just to give you a snapshot, I'll briefly dive into what the Angeles National Forest works with, you know, and some of the partners that we work with in some way, shape, or form. So first, I'll call out some of our external entities, state, county, city, and nonprofits. We do have the ability to partner with them. And so we've done a lot of partnerships, including, you know, interagency fire agreements with the local foothill communities that are primarily managed by our firefighters. The National Forest Foundation, as you heard in the previous presentation, worked a lot on the Angeles National Forest, and we're really excited. I have a slide later dedicated to the National Forest Foundation to kind of give more examples of how we work together on the proactive side of reducing wildfire risk as well as other areas. And then also the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. They've been a great partner with us for close to 10 years now on managing a wildfire restoration grant program with the Angeles and the Los Padres National Forest as well, which kind of crosses the landscape. We also work with organizations such as California Botanic Gardens. We have the interagency fire agreements that I mentioned with federal folks. And we also work with interagency federal support agreements. And so that would be, you know, the folks like Marti Witter, who actually helped us with our wildfire restoration grant program and advising, you know, how we went about doing some of that restoration work. Internally, I'd also like to call out our Pacific Southwest Research Station. We do have a branch of the Forest Service that does research. And so between the research station, we also have state and private forestry that dedicates themselves to working with private landowners on forestry management. Those two organizations within the Forest Service and the National Forest System, which is the land base, we actually also have an effort called the LA Urban Center for Natural Resource Sustainability. It's primarily focused on research, but it is located out of downtown LA, El Pueblo de Los Angeles, otherwise known as Placita Olvera. And we do have an outreach coordinator there, and then also a researcher that work out of there, kind of look at all these wildland urban interface environments. So as you can see, we're creating this very collaborative space for folks to come together, share ideas, and think about the National Forest System when they think about the landscape surrounding the urban interface. And also our shared stewardship partnership coordinators. We're starting to see within the Forest Service a lot more forests picking up partnership coordinators or shared stewardship coordinators. We kind of use that language interchangeably in the agency as we continue to develop our capacity to work in partnership. Next slide, please. So here's the two case studies I wanted to dive into. So I'll keep it brief, but in essence, what I wanted to share about our partnership with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation is that they've allowed us to work at scale. In recent history, we've had, well, obviously lots of fires, but we had two big fire settlements that we were happy to receive in order to restore some of the damage that was caused primarily by the copper fire and then later the powerhouse fire up in the northern part of the Angeles National Forest. And so in order to kind of cover that wide of a landscape, we needed to engage a lot of partners in a timely fashion. Within the Forest Service, we mentioned our capacity can be quite limited when it comes to being the program managers for a lot of these projects, but through partnerships, we're able to accomplish a lot more. So there you see a list of what we consider grantees. National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, being our partner, has administered these funds as well as leveraged those funds to extend further. And these grantees bring their resources to the table to help us accomplish a lot of meaningful projects. So I'm not necessarily going to read what's on the screen there, but I did want to paint a picture of one way we were able to sign in this case, a participating agreement with National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, first for 5 years, and then we renewed it for another 5 years. And in that creative way, we're able to get a lot more partners and grantees on the landscape. And many of these grantees we're noticing are turning into partners themselves, turning the corner and either becoming volunteer groups or partners to help us maintain some of the restoration sites. Next slide, please. Okay, and then the National Forest Foundation, they called this out in their slide as well, and so did our forest supervisor. This is kind of a big deal to us, the fact that the Los San Gabriel Rivers and Mountains Conservancy has this wildfire resilience grant, and National Forest Foundation was able to step in and help us take advantage of $4 million that will now be put towards job development as well as fuels reduction across the Angeles National Forest within the RMC boundary. And so that kind of speaks to some of our cross-boundary solutions that we're looking for with this shared stewardship strategy. Just to mention a couple other partnerships that don't pertain to, well, actually, Powerhouse Fire, National Forest Foundation, we did partner with them directly to help us with some recreation, reforestation, and restoration projects. They're a little bit more dynamic and nimble in that regard. And they act as great program managers on our behalf in collaboration with us. And then lastly, we have several other partnership projects that deal with recreation, some visual mitigation due to power lines, state OHV support and helping us kind of manage some of that. And as we mentioned before, some toilet demolition and replacement on the National Forest that came in handy during the pandemic. So with this slide, really what I wanted to share with folks is that partners do play a key role. Oftentimes, if there's a challenge for the forest to partner directly, the National Forest Foundation has been able to step in on our behalf and really facilitate a lot of our relationships with externals. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah, there we go. So just to, as I'm getting close to finishing up here, I just wanted to kind of put out a call to action for everyone here and everyone that might see this video, the opportunities and the challenges. On the left, I have a snapshot of the beginnings of a partnership map on the Angeles National Forest. As you can see, we're spread out across the landscape. We do have 2 ranger districts, one being the Alea Gateway District and the other being the San Gabriel Mountains National Monument. And so between the 2 district offices, we look at where we can partner and be strategic and accomplish projects through partnerships. But looking forward, really the message I want to leave everyone with is that we're seeking leverage with partners. We have such a big land base, we can't do it alone. Not only that, there is a lot of cross-boundary opportunities with state partnerships, grant opportunities. We can always utilize cooperative agreements if the partner is willing to receive the funds and spend it on the National Forest. I talked a little bit about interagency fire agreements, which we renew every 5 years with our local entities and partners, shared stewardship agreements, and just really trying to accomplish a lot of cross-boundary landscape scale projects. And that definitely is going to require a lot of us to get together and make some plans and implement some plans together. Next slide. Yep. And that's the end of my presentation for you all today. Hopefully you got some value out of it, and yeah, look forward to the Q&A. Thank you. Oh, and these are, yeah, those are just some of the resources you'll find on the website if you go down there. So yeah, thank you.
Hi, Michelle. This is Steve Arakawa. I just wanted to jump in and say we thought maybe 15 minutes of Q&A, and then we would just finish up following that. It shouldn't take much more than 5:40.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. And thank you to everyone. This has been such an interesting panel. I was unable to join the first 2 days, but I can see how, this really brings everything together, really focusing on community and, the public. So we've talked about community education, we've talked about outreach, collaborative partnerships, and then really addressing some of the most vulnerable populations and ways that we can do that with some of these projects. So I wanted to just kind of throw out, instead of asking anything individually, just a group question as we're thinking about,
Michelle?
Yeah.
Just before you ask that question,
Sure.
Sorry, I just want to put in a pitch because some people may leave us early today. Council staff just shared a link to 3 surveys. There's a separate survey for each day. It really helps us justify the work we do putting together symposia like this and helps us improve them. So please fill those out. Sorry, back to you.
No worries. And if just back to the group, if you have, the audience has questions, continue to put them in the Q&A and I will monitor it. But we have about 14 minutes for questions. So, my background is in studying partnerships and collaborations. And, we've talked some about, Fabian just did a great job about talking about shared stewardship. And I think it's been a thread that's been woven throughout. But I am curious if there are ways or opportunities that you think are being missed, groups that are maybe being left out of some of these conversations that we could do a better job of engaging, or if you have examples of engaging with maybe groups that aren't always at the table. Sabrina.
So just before I joined the symposium today, I was listening to a lecture by a colleague of mine at UC Irvine about the inequity and impacts that are felt by vulnerable communities. And he was actually looking specifically at the Thomas Fire and some of the impacts to farm workers and to their livelihoods, to their health individually, to their economic security, et cetera, et cetera. And it definitely made me think about both the Thomas Fire, which I lived in Ventura during, and the mudslide after that, which actually also affected a lot of individuals who were sort of legacy homeowners. Actually, a lot of the people who lived in the lower parts of that canyon were Chumash folks, and also a lot of sort of lower income domestic and tourism-based employees. And I think it is important for us to realize that the challenge of wildfire and the other challenges we're going to face due to climate change are not things that just happen where the incident occurs. But we really, we talked a little bit at the first session about air quality and health, and those have kind of been, up until maybe these last few years, kind of a secondary consideration for those of us working on wildfire. So I think that's important. I also hope that some of the work that we've done actually with Dania and Fabian, bringing the California Naturalist Program to some of the workforce education participants who they supported, will give us a core of folks who can work on these issues and who speak multiple languages. That was actually a big challenge in the Thomas Fire. For about the first 10 days or so, there was almost no information available in Spanish.
Thanks, Sabrina. Antoine.
Yeah, I like that was a great segue that Sabrina just gave me about the website that we published. We are actively working on putting out a translation that is not just a Google Translate translation. So we're actually contracting with a professional that can really tailor the language to the local communities, including communities that, yes, are not always served by our programs. An interesting program that we started now with the California Fire Safe Council, a grant from the California Fire Safe Council, is to look at communities that are in LA County, located in this intersection of the wildland-urban interface and the social vulnerability index. And we're trying to really identify those communities that can be vulnerable to wildfire or the consequences of wildfire, as Sabrina mentioned, and really export our programs out there, trying to reach those areas that may not always benefit from all those programs.
Thank you. And thinking about, kind of building on that and thinking about Rachel and Dave, you both serve a wide base of customers. And, I'm wondering if there are community-based groups or, relationships that you've built where there's sort of the bridge to your customers, if there are any examples there. And if you could talk a little bit more about that.
You want me to go first, Dave?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we have a number of means and methods that we utilize to interact with our customers. That's definitely been a focus for us over the last several years, as we've seen that kind of need rise within the area. We've tried to build partnerships through, there's a number of levels, right? From, kind of an agency on down, agency relations on down. And then we have, a sector that just focuses on the customer population, producing materials in multiple languages, delivering messages in multiple ways so that we're making sure that the customers are getting them. Offering resources to those that are in the low income bracket, as well as trying to offer community centers and things of that sort when emergencies do happen. So definitely a lot of work going on in that space from the utility perspective. And obviously we cover a really large service territory, so we deal with a lot of different demographics, different groups throughout the service territory.
And I'll just add, that was a challenge we had during the fire, is just communication and getting communications out to folks across the service area. Something that we did after the fire, we purchased a system called Everbridge. Some of you might be familiar with it, or you might know it as Nixle. You get these Nixle alerts. So a really awesome system to help you communicate and to geographically target your communications. So we are using that, and we're also using that with our employees too. But there's, in our district, there's a lot of HOAs. The HOAs tend to have really good contact with their residents. And so we did work with the HOAs to contact folks, and also with there's the Las Virgenes Federation of Homeowners, which also has a lot of good contacts. And then just community leaders that we know, people who live in Malibu Lake that we just happen to know, they have a way of getting word out about things. And so having those contacts and knowing those folks and having relationships is important.
Thank you. And
Yeah,
Fabian, go ahead, Rachel.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say that's a great point. We also use Everbridge as well. But one thing I will just say, it's a great point around customer contact information, because if we don't have the right contact information, we can't get the message out. So we've definitely gone through a big campaign to help people update their contact information and also make sure and verify that we have the right information, especially for emergencies.
Yeah, and it just seems like it's so important to, meet people where they are and have these myriad ways of outreach and communication, different languages, but also, high tech, low tech, direct communication, utility bills, all sorts of ways. So, so I'm glad to hear that. I did have a question just sort of specifically for Fabian about the shared stewardship, and you have these long lists of partners and kind of, I'm wondering how the structure of getting involved with one of these shared stewardship projects or agreements would work. How would somebody get started? How would a group, contact you or get involved?
Yeah, that's a great question. Usually it's through their direct counterpart on the National Forest. For example, I know we have probably the largest workforce on the Angeles is our fire organization. We have Chief 1, Chief 2, and Chief 3, and then of course our battalion chiefs and all the way on down the line. They usually do interface with a lot of our other wildfire management agencies. When it comes to restoration, we have a resource officer that kind of oversees all our botanists, biologists, and just the restoration aspect of the National Forest. I myself can be contacted as a partnership coordinator if it's related more to, interface with the public, recreation, or public affairs. I can make those contacts. So it is a very fluid process. I will say that, and thank everyone up front for their patience. We are a bit of a bureaucracy in the federal government, but this shared stewardship platform does give us an opportunity to dialogue, collaborate, and look for ways to provide some synergy. So I'm happy to kind of field folks' questions and then plug them into their right counterpart so we can continue these dialogues and find that synergy.
Thank you. Sabrina.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, I put a resource in the chat that I've been trying to work with more, the Listos California program. And I look forward to engaging with them more in these conversations about building wildfire resilience in Southern California. If people aren't aware of them, they are, it's a program out of the Office of Emergency Services that provides a lot of disaster preparedness information in, I think they have 5 main languages that they work in. And they might be somebody, again, in Ventura County, they really didn't have anyone at the fire department involved in PIO work who spoke Spanish, apparently. So they couldn't get a lot of the information out. And I think they can be a really good resource for especially smaller agencies that find themselves in that situation. So they have English, Spanish, Chinese, Vietnamese, and Filipino and Korean.
Thank you. And I'm assuming that will go on the council's list of resources. Great. Well, we have a few minutes left. I'm really wondering if any of you have questions for each other as you've been listening to the presentations. If there's anything you'd like to pose to your fellow panelists, any burning questions that came up.
I'm kind of curious to hear some of the reactions folks get when they talk to homeowners. I feel like a lot of homeowners probably look at the space when it's available and think it's beautiful, but then when they realize they have all these different requirements to meet to get it wildfire ready, or worse yet, after a wildfire, do you get any kind of like not resistance, but just like surprise that, oh wow, I have to do all of this in order to live in these neighborhoods? Or is it well known?
I can try to give a beginning of an answer. I mean, it varies a lot depending on the communities, but very often the case when we do home evaluation, there's a need to recenter the conversation. When we arrive on site, homeowners very often have not preconceived idea, but they have strong feelings about the neighbor street or about the landscape managed by the Park Service, as was mentioned previously. So it's always important to listen and to really kind of like educate, to recenter the conversation, being like, yes, maybe this is important, but let's start looking like, let's go the home outwards. It's always the same message. Let's focus on the home, and then we can look at the landscape and the concern. So it's really a an exercise of equilibrium between listening, but yes, doing a lot of education and recentering the conversation. Usually people are willing to listen.
I just wanted to follow up with a kind of a pointed question for Antoine, and I know this is something that I've battled with as well. Are insurance companies listening?
I'm trying to get more and more in touch with insurance companies. One of the strengths of the RCD, what that allowed us to have the program that we have and reach out to the communities, is we are a non-regulatory agency, and our programs, we don't share any type of information with insurance company or fire agency, but there is this very strong concern about losing your coverage or the type of inspection that insurance company are now doing. So I'm always listening to what the commissioner, Lara, the insurance commissioner, is putting out, especially regarding transparency of the insurance industry. But there is a very strong concern. Sometimes it's what prevents homeowners from taking action. They kind of like want to stay under the radar and don't want to engage in this type of work by worry of being canceled by their insurance policy.
Thank you. I just want to end by repeating what Ben had said earlier, his slip, that I still really appreciate of this idea of cultural adaptation. I think we need to be thinking differently, and all of your presentations really covered different aspects of that. So I really value all of your perspectives, all of your work, and thank you to the council for having me as moderator. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Michelle, and that's really good food for thought. Thanks very much. Great job to panel number 2. So we just want to keep you on just for a few more minutes so that we can wrap up, both Eileen and I'm going to start, and then we'll kind of trade back and forth, but we'll be quick. We'd like to thank you all for joining us today. I think it was a great session for us anyway, and it was a great series of sessions where we learned a lot. We've heard a lot about weather, water, weeds, and wildlife, and today about people and our role in protecting public safety and property. We've learned that preservation of our natural landscapes is not only possible, but it can be done right. If it's done right, we can help protect us from fires and that are too large, fast, and frequent. And I'd like to hand it over to Eileen for a few thoughts.
Thanks, Steve, and thank you all. Just a quick, it's just given just how quickly our climate is changing, it'll be essential for all of us to listen to the scientists, the land managers, the botanists, the biologists, all of those that have joined us today and in the previous 2 days. And there's a number of ways that you can do this and that we can all do this, starting with the Fire Science Consortium website. It's a great place to start. So too is the defensiblespace.org, and UC's Climate Stewards in California Natural Science Naturalist Program, which we heard about today. We heard about some of these, and there's more on our websites. We hope that you'll visit our webpage for the symposium, watershedhealth.org, to find more, to find these and other resources. And if you have other resources to share, there's an opportunity on the symposium webpage to do so. I do want to share one thing and one more before we kind of leave. You've already shared with us some of your takeaways from the past 2 sessions, and these came from your survey responses. And these are all, these really do help us know what we're doing well with these symposia. As Sabrina said, it's really helpful for us to use this feedback to plan for the next one. And we encourage you to complete the survey for day 3. There's a link in the chat, and we'll follow up with email just in case you've missed it. Again, the results from the symposium surveys will help us plan for our 2022 annual symposium. We'll be starting that planning before we know it. It's one way that we convene everyone around a topic of interest, and we certainly will follow up with notices for our upcoming annual symposium, as well as seminars and workshops that we have planned for the near future. So again, thank you all. I'm going to pass it back to Steve so he can close us out with some final thoughts and some final thank yous. We'll hope
Thank you, Eileen. Thanks very much. And I want to thank everybody on behalf of the council board, and want to specifically thank Michelle and Clark for a great job in moderating the panels today, and both panels 1 and panels 2. I'd like to thank you know, how all of the information was shared, the presentations, they're very engaging. I want to thank Sabrina Drill and the UC Agriculture and Natural Resources for their support for this event. That's important to us. And, you know, the council, you know, our mission is to bring parties together and to try to understand and to resolve issues. So this is what we're all about. And I feel this series of sessions was really helpful in doing so. I would like to thank the staff. I'd like to thank Eileen Alduenda. I'd like to thank Drew Reedy, Elise Eberhard, and all of the staff shown here, not in any particular order, but they all played a role in making all of this happen. So thanks to the staff. I'd like to thank our sponsors. So each of them, thank you very much. This is support that is really important to the council doing its work. And next, I would just like to close in saying that recordings of this event will be on the event website by early next week. So you can use that as a reference to go back to. Keep an eye out for future publications, a publication where some of our presenters will author articles expanding on today's presentation. So I think that's something to look forward to. And again, thank you all for taking time out today and hanging in there with us, you know, being later than 5:30. So we really appreciate your willingness to hang in there. And I hope you all have a good evening tonight.
Thanks, everyone.